What if the most famous escape story in human history was never just about escape? Most people hear the story of the Exodus and picture one moment: a staff raised over the Red Sea, walls of water, Pharaoh's army was swallowed by the waves, a dramatic miracle, a powerful ending. But the truth is far stranger than that. Because the Exodus was not a single event. It was a slow collision between two civilizations, a clash between the gods of Egypt and the God of a small enslaved people, a confrontation that unfolded across cities like Ramesses, Pithom, and the fertile delta of the Nile. It passed through the halls of Pharaoh, the desert routes of the Sinai Peninsula, and the memory of a people who had once walked with Abraham in Canaan. And something even deeper was happening beneath the surface. Jewish teachers writing in Jerusalem centuries later believed the Exodus was the moment Israel discovered who their God truly was. Early Christian writers in places like Antioch and Alexandria read the same story and saw a shadow of something greater, an event that would echo forward into the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Even the New Testament keeps returning to it. The Gospel writers speak of deliverance using the language of Exodus. The book of Revelation imagines the fall of oppressive empires in imagery drawn straight from the plagues of Egypt. And the Apostle Paul, writing to a church in Corinth, warns that the story of Israel in the wilderness is not just history. It is a mirror. So the Exodus is not simply about Pharaoh, Moses, or a parted sea. It is about power, memory, identity. It is about what happens when a people shaped by slavery suddenly encounter freedom. And it begins long before Moses ever steps into Pharaoh's court. To understand the night the sea opened, we have to go back to the moment Israel first arrived in Egypt, and why they never left. Long before Moses stood before Pharaoh, before the plagues, before the sea, before the desert journey, the story of the Exodus began with a famine. Not a small drought, a regional catastrophe. Across the eastern Mediterranean world in the late Bronze Age, food shortages could break kingdoms. Grain failed in Canaan, pastures dried, and families who had lived for generations on the same hills suddenly faced a quiet enemy: starvation. Among those families was the household of Jacob, grandson of Abraham, living near Hebron in the hill country of southern Canaan. The family was large, complicated, fractured by jealousy and old wounds. Years earlier, one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, had been sold by his own brothers to traders moving south along the caravan routes that linked Canaan to the Nile Delta. Those traders likely belonged to merchant groups that Egyptian records sometimes called Asiatics, people from the Levant who traveled the trade roads between Gaza, Megiddo, and the Nile frontier. Joseph disappeared into Egypt. And Egypt was no small destination. At the time, Egypt stood as one of the most stable and organized civilizations on earth. Its political center lay along the Nile, with administrative cities and royal compounds stretching from Memphis in the north to Thebes in the south. Bureaucrats recorded harvests, priests maintained temple rituals, and scribes tracked everything from taxation to grain storage. Egypt understood famine. For centuries the Nile had determined life or death. When the river flooded well, fields flourished. When the flood failed, the consequences spread quickly. So Egypt built grain reserves. Genesis tells the story this way. Joseph, after years of hardship, rose through the ranks of Pharaoh's administration because of his ability to interpret dreams, particularly Pharaoh's troubling vision of 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Ancient Jewish interpreters later reflected on this moment with fascination. Josephus, writing in the 1st century in Rome, describes Joseph as a brilliant administrator who organized national grain storage during the years of plenty. Even Egyptian texts from different periods speak of officials responsible for managing royal granaries during difficult seasons. Whether one reads the account through theology or history, the narrative carries a clear picture. Joseph became a powerful official inside Egypt's system, which meant when famine reached Canaan, his family had somewhere to go. Imagine the moment. Caravans moving south across dry hills, donkeys loaded with sacks and family belongings, shepherds leaving ancestral land behind. Jacob's family arrives in Egypt not as conquerors, not as immigrants seeking opportunity, but as refugees. And Egypt receives them. The pharaoh of that generation grants them land in Goshen, a fertile region in the eastern Nile Delta. Goshen sits near Egypt's northeastern frontier, close to trade routes that connect Egypt with Sinai and the Levant. For pastoral people like Jacob's family, Goshen makes sense. Egyptian society centered heavily on agriculture along the Nile Valley, and shepherding cultures from Canaan often lived on the margins of Egyptian territory. Genesis even hints at a cultural gap. Egyptians traditionally looked down on shepherds. So the arrangement works. Israel's ancestors settled in Goshen. The biblical record lists 70 members of Jacob's household entering Egypt, a small clan, extended family, nothing more. At this stage there is no nation, no exodus, no slavery, just a family surviving a famine. And Joseph stands at the center of it all, both a son of Jacob and a servant of Pharaoh. It is a strange position. He speaks Egyptian. He administers Egyptian policy. He dresses like an official of the court. Yet he carries the memory of promises spoken generations earlier to Abraham in the land of Canaan. Promises about land, about descendants, about a future no one fully understands yet. For the moment, though, the situation appears stable. Jacob's family thrives in Goshen. Livestock multiply, children are born, generations pass. And slowly, almost quietly, a transformation begins. A family becomes a tribe. A tribe begins to look like a people. Now pause and think about the setting. Israel is not forming in isolation. It is growing inside the borders of one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. The Nile flows, Egyptian temples rise, pharaohs rule from palaces decorated with scenes of divine kingship. Meanwhile, in the delta marshlands of Goshen, the descendants of Jacob increase. Decades pass, then centuries, and something important begins to fade. The memory of Joseph. The memory of why these foreigners were welcomed. History, especially inside empires, can be surprisingly short. Dynasties chain. Kings rise and fall. And the favor once granted to Joseph's family slowly disappears into the background of Egypt's long political story. What began as hospitality will not remain that way forever. Because one day, a new pharaoh will look at the growing population in Goshen and see no guests, but a problem. And when that moment arrives, the quiet story of migration will begin to turn into something darker. Something that will eventually lead to the night the sea opened. Generations passed in the land of Goshen, and with each passing decade, the memory of Joseph slowly faded into the background of Egypt's long and crowded history. Empires are like that. They move forward quickly. What mattered deeply to one generation can become little more than a footnote to the next. Joseph had once stood near the center of Egyptian power. Genesis describes him wearing the signet ring of Pharaoh, riding in royal chariots, issuing orders that shaped the nation's food supply. But Egypt had ruled for thousands of years before Joseph arrived, and it would rule long after he was gone. New kings took the throne, new court officials filled the halls, new concerns replaced the old. And somewhere within that change, Joseph's story became distant. But the descendants of Jacob did not disappear. They multiplied. The book of Exodus opens with a striking line that ancient readers immediately noticed. It says the Israelites were fruitful and increased greatly. The language echoes something much older, the blessing first spoken in Genesis when God told humanity to multiply and fill the earth. Jewish teachers in Jerusalem centuries later pointed out that this wording is not accidental. It suggests that Israel's growth in Egypt was not random population expansion. It was tied to the same promise given to Abraham, repeated to Isaac, and later spoken again to Jacob. A promise about descendants, about a people who would eventually become numerous. So while Egypt saw a growing labor force in the Nile Delta, the biblical narrative sees something deeper unfolding. A promise quietly expanding inside a foreign land. Picture the region. The eastern Nile Delta was not the monumental Egypt most people imagine today. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor stood far to the south in Thebes. The pyramids near Giza belonged to an earlier era. But the delta itself was a patchwork of canals, farmland, marshlands, and settlements linked to trade routes leading toward Canaan and Sinai. It was a frontier region. Foreign merchants moved through it. Nomadic groups passed nearby. Armies sometimes marched along its roads. And that location would eventually become important. Because Israel was not just multiplying. They were multiplying near Egypt's most sensitive border. Egyptian rulers had good reason to watch that frontier carefully. For centuries, groups from the Levant had entered the delta. In fact, during one turbulent period known as the Hyksos era, foreign rulers from the northeast actually seized control of northern Egypt for a time. By the era remembered in Exodus, those foreign rulers had been expelled, but the memory lingered. Egypt did not like instability along its borders. Now imagine being an Egyptian official watching the population trends in Goshen. People with different customs, different languages, different ancestral traditions, and they are growing rapidly. To the Israelites themselves, this growth likely felt like a blessing. Children were born, families expanded, herds increased. Life continued generation after generation. But to Egypt's leadership, the numbers began to raise questions. Questions about loyalty. Questions about security. Questions about what might happen if war ever came from the northeast. The book of Exodus later summarizes the political anxiety in a simple but revealing line. Egyptian leaders begin to worry that if enemies attack, the Israelites might side with them and escape the land. Think about that fear. Israel lived inside Egypt, but they were not Egyptians. They remembered ancestors buried in Canaan. They spoke a Semitic language related to peoples east of the Sinai. And they lived precisely in the region where invading forces historically approached. From the Egyptian perspective, the situation looked risky. From the Israelite perspective, life probably felt ordinary. Families working the land, children growing up, stories passed down about Abraham, about Joseph, about the God who had guided their ancestors. But the longer the years passed, the more the cultural distance between Israel and Egypt became visible. Egypt had its gods. Ra, the sun god who sailed across the sky. Osiris, lord of the afterlife. Isis, divine mother. Temples stood across the land, Priests maintained rituals, and Pharaoh himself was seen as a divine figure maintaining cosmic order, what Egyptians called mad. Israel had something else. Not temples, not statues, but memory. Memory of a God who spoke to Abraham near Shechem. A God who wrestled with Jacob by the Jabbok River. A God who guided Joseph's strange journey from slave to governor. These memories shaped identity. And identity inside a powerful empire can be unsettling. Now pause and imagine the view from the palace. Pharaoh sits in a court surrounded by advisors, military officials, and administrators responsible for Egypt's security. Reports come from the Delta. Population increases among the Hebrews. Their settlements expand. Their numbers continue to rise. And somewhere in that room, someone begins to ask the question that will change everything. What if they become too many? It is a quiet question at first, but it carries enormous consequences. Because once leaders start viewing a population as a threat rather than neighbors, policies change. And that shift, from tolerance to suspicion, will slowly reshape the future of Israel and Egypt. The family that entered Egypt seeking refuge is about to encounter a very different reality. A new pharaoh will rise, and he will not remember Joseph. History rarely changes in a single moment. More often it shifts slowly, like the current of the Nile, steady and quiet until one day the landscape looks completely different. For generations, the descendants of Jacob had lived in Goshen, raising livestock, building families, and watching their numbers grow. Their story unfolded on the edges of Egypt's grand civilization, far from the royal temples of Thebes and the monuments near Memphis. But empires are always changing. Dynasties rise, dynasties fall, court officials are replaced, political priorities shift with each new ruler. And somewhere within those transitions, the memory of Joseph finally disappeared. The book of Exodus captures this turning point with a stark sentence. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That line is more than personal forgetfulness. It signals a political reset. In ancient Egypt, royal administrations did not always preserve the legacy of previous regimes. When power shifted, especially after major political upheavals, new rulers often rewrote history in ways that strengthened their own authority. Scholars who study Egyptian history often point to periods like the transition into the New Kingdom, when Egypt emerged from earlier instability and began rebuilding its imperial power. Kings such as Amos I expelled foreign rulers and reasserted control over the Nile Valley and its surrounding territories. Whether the pharaoh of Exodus belonged to that era or a slightly later one remains debated among historians. But the biblical description fits a pattern known in Egyptian politics: a strong ruler consolidating power and viewing foreign populations with suspicion. From Pharaoh's perspective, the Israelites were a demographic puzzle. They were not Egyptians. They were not temporary visitors either. They were a large community living near Egypt's northeastern frontier, exactly where military threats historically entered the land. And their numbers were still increasing. Now imagine the royal council. Military commanders familiar with the desert routes through Sinai. Administrators responsible for labor projects across the Nile Delta. Priests advising Pharaoh on maintaining order under the watch of Egypt's gods. Together they face a question. What should be done about the Hebrews? The concern was not entirely irrational. Egypt's frontier regions had always been sensitive zones. Trade routes from Canaan, Ugarit, and Byblos moved through the same corridors where armies sometimes marched. Egyptian relief carvings from temple walls often depict pharaoh defeating Asiatic enemies approaching from the northeast. The presence of a large foreign population in that region could easily become a political concern. So Pharaoh chooses a strategy that empires have used throughout history. Control through labor. The Israelites are placed under forced work programs organized by Egyptian taskmasters. They are sent to build storage cities, major supply centers for the crown. The Book of Exodus names two of them, Pithom and Ramesses. These were not small projects. Egyptian construction sites required enormous labor forces. Archaeological evidence from the Nile Valley shows how the state organized workers into large crews, supervised by scribes who recorded quotas of bricks, stone blocks, or agricultural production. For the Israelites, life changes dramatically. The people who once arrived as guests now find themselves absorbed into Egypt's labor machine. Days become long. Brick kilns burn under the delta sun. Mud mixed with straw is shaped into blocks for storage complexes, walls, and administrative centers. The transformation from pastoral family to laboring population happens gradually, but its psychological impact runs deep. Jewish traditions later remembered this era not only as physical oppression, but as something that threatened Israel's identity. Rabbinic writings from centuries later describe the Egyptians attempting to erase Hebrew distinctiveness, pushing them deeper into the machinery of imperial life. Whether these later interpretations reflect historical detail or theological reflection, they capture an important truth. Slavery changes how people see themselves. It reshapes memory. It narrows horizons. And it can make promises spoken long ago begin to feel distant. Yet something surprising happens. Despite the pressure, despite the labor, despite the attempt to control their growth, Israel continues to multiply. Exodus repeats the idea again. The more they were oppressed, the more they increased. To Pharaoh and his officials, this must have looked alarming. The policy designed to contain the Hebrews appears to have the opposite effect. Population numbers rise. Communities expand. Children continue to be born. And with every generation, the Hebrew presence in Goshen becomes more visible. Egypt's response hardens. What began as labor regulation began sliding towards something darker. Fear is a powerful force inside political systems. Once leaders believe a population threatens national stability, the logic of control can quickly become ruthless. Soon Pharaoh will take a step that crosses a terrifying line, one that moves beyond forced labor into something far more brutal. But the story of Exodus does not only move downward into oppression. At the very moment Egypt tightens its grip, a child will be born, a child whose life will begin in secrecy along the banks of the Nile. And that child will one day stand before Pharaoh himself. Power always comes with a question: who belongs and who does not? In the Egypt of the New Kingdom, Pharaoh ruled not only as king but as the living guarantor of order. Egyptian thought called that order Mad, the balance of the world, the harmony between gods, kings, nature, and society. Maintaining Mad was Pharaoh's sacred duty. Chaos was the enemy. Foreign threats, internal instability, demographic shifts, anything that might weaken Egypt's stability had to be controlled before it grew dangerous. And in the eastern Nile Delta, the growing population of Hebrews had begun to trouble the royal court. The Book of Exodus captures the reasoning behind the new policy with unsettling clarity. Egyptian leaders looked at the Israelites and said, in essence, they are becoming too many. If war breaks out, they might join our enemies and leave the land. Think carefully about that statement. The fear was not that Israel would revolt alone. The fear was that they might align with outside forces. And historically, that fear made sense. The northeastern frontier had always been Egypt's weak point. The trade routes running through Gaza, Ashkelon, and the Via Maris connected Egypt to the Levant, lands that included Canaan, Ugarit, and later powerful kingdoms like the Hittite Empire. Armies moved along those same roads. Egyptian records carved into temple walls at Karnak and Medinet Habu celebrate pharaohs who marched north to fight enemies from Mitanni, Hatti, and various Canaanite city-states. To the Egyptian mind, the eastern frontier was never entirely safe. And the Israelites lived right there, in Goshen. So the government responds with a strategy that seems practical at first: forced labor. Egypt was famous for its massive construction projects. Temples, fortifications, administrative cities, storage complexes, all required labor forces that could number in the tens of thousands. Workers mixed mud bricks, hauled stone, and constructed large state buildings under strict supervision. Exodus names two cities connected to Israel's labor: Pithom and Ramesses. The exact identification of Pithom is debated among archaeologists, though many link it with sites in the eastern delta such as Tel El Maskuta. The city of Ramesses is often associated with Pi-Ramesses, the great capital built by Pharaoh Ramesses II centuries later in the same region. Whether the biblical name refers directly to that later city or to an earlier settlement in the delta, the geography fits the story well. These were frontier supply cities, storehouses for grain, logistics hubs for armies moving toward Sinai, places where the Egyptian state kept resources ready for war. Now imagine the scene. Work crews forming before sunrise, overseers with writing tablets recording daily quotas, brickmakers mixing mud with chopped straw from the delta fields, kilns burning under the heat of the Egyptian sun. Egyptian art from tombs and monuments actually shows scenes very much like this: laborers kneading mud with their feet, workers shaping bricks in wooden molds, supervisors watching closely. And in Exodus, the Israelites become part of that system. Their days are filled with work. Their lives revolve around quotas. Their future, as far as Pharaoh is concerned, lies in service to the state. But the policy has an unexpected result. The more Egypt tries to control Israel, the more Israel grows. Exodus repeats the phrase almost like a drumbeat: the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. To Egyptian officials, this must have seemed unsettling. Control was supposed to stabilize the situation. Instead, the population continued expanding. Now pause for a moment. Imagine standing in Goshen during those years. Dust rising from construction sites. Families living under increasing pressure. Children hearing stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, while their parents work under Egyptian supervision. A strange tension fills the community. They are still alive, still growing, but their freedom is disappearing. And somewhere deep inside their collective memory lies a promise spoken centuries earlier, that Abraham's descendants would become a great people. The irony is difficult to miss. Israel is indeed becoming numerous, but they are doing so inside a system of forced labor, inside an empire that sees them not as heirs of a promise, but as a workforce. And Pharaoh is about to decide that labor control is not enough. Because if population growth cannot be slowed through work, then something harsher will be required. Oppression rarely begins with open brutality. It begins with policy. From the Egyptian point of view, the first solution had been reasonable enough. Put the Hebrews to work. Absorb their growing population into the machinery of the state. Keep them busy building supply cities like Pithom and Ramesses, where their labor would strengthen Egypt rather than threaten it. But the policy did not solve the deeper anxiety. Israel kept growing. Every generation added more families to the settlements of Goshen. The rhythm of life continued despite the pressure: marriages, births, children running through the dusty lanes of worker communities along the eastern Nile Delta. To the Israelites, growth felt like survival. To Pharaoh, it felt like danger. And fear, when it settles inside a government, has a way of escalating. The book of Exodus describes the next shift with unsettling clarity. The Egyptians made the Israelites serve with ruthless rigor. Work was no longer merely organized labor. It became harsh, relentless. The Hebrew description paints a picture of grinding exhaustion. Field work under supervision. Brick production under quotas. Daily life defined by the demands of Egyptian overseers. Ancient Egyptian records give us glimpses of this system. Papyrus documents like the Anastasi texts, used to train Egyptian scribes, mention labor crews responsible for construction and agricultural tasks. Overseers monitored productivity closely, and failure to meet quotas could lead to punishment. Empires ran on labor, and now Israel's lives were tied directly to that system. But Pharaoh's concern had moved beyond labor control. Population growth remained the real problem. And so a darker idea began to circulate in the halls of power. If the Hebrews continued to multiply, they might eventually outnumber the local Egyptian population in the frontier region. If enemies from Canaan or Syria attacked along the trade routes of the Via Maris, those Hebrews might align themselves with the invading force. This fear, whether exaggerated or not, pushed Pharaoh toward a decision that crossed a moral line. He summoned 2 Hebrew midwives. The text of Exodus preserves their names, Shiphrah and Puah. Names matter in ancient texts. The Bible rarely records the names of ordinary people unless their actions carry lasting significance. Pharaoh himself remains unnamed in the Exodus story, but these 2 women are remembered. That detail alone is striking. The king of Egypt commands power across an empire, yet the narrative gives identity to 2 midwives. Because what happens next will define the moment. Pharaoh gives them an order. When Hebrew women give birth, they are to examine the child. If it is a boy, the baby must be killed. If it is a girl, she may live. Think about the implications of that command. This is not random cruelty. It is targeted population control. Male children represent future strength, future warriors, future leaders. Eliminating them would weaken the Hebrew community over time, reducing its ability to grow into a political threat. Policies like this have appeared in many moments of history. When governments fear a group's potential influence, they often aim at the next generation. But something unexpected happens. The midwives refuse. Exodus says they feared God. That phrase is simple, but it carries enormous weight. In ancient Jewish understanding, fearing God meant recognizing a moral authority higher than any king. Pharaoh may rule Egypt, but he does not rule everything. So Shiphrah and Puah quietly defy the order. They allow the Hebrew boys to live. When Pharaoh demands an explanation, they answer with a clever excuse. Hebrew women, they say, are vigorous. They give birth before the midwives arrive. Whether Pharaoh believed the explanation or not is unclear, but the babies continue to live. And the population continues to grow. Jewish tradition later honored these two women for their courage. Rabbinic interpretations preserved in the Talmud describe them as righteous figures who chose loyalty to God over obedience to a tyrant. Their resistance marks a subtle but powerful turning point in the story. Until now, Egypt has controlled the narrative. Policies are issued. Labor is imposed. Commands are given. But here, quietly, two women disrupt the system. No armies. No public rebellion. Just a refusal to obey an immoral command. It is the first act of resistance in the Exodus story. And it reveals something important. Even inside an empire built on absolute authority, there are limits. Pharaoh can command, but he cannot control the conscience of every person under his rule. Still, the king of Egypt is not a man who gives up easily. When his secret policy fails, he abandons subtlety altogether. If the midwives will not carry out his order, then the entire nation will be forced to participate. A new decree will go out across Egypt, one that turns the Nile River itself into a place of death. And somewhere in the Hebrew community of Goshen, a child will soon be born into that terrifying world. A child whose life will begin in hiding. A child who will grow up in the shadow of Pharaoh's own palace. His name will be Moses. When quiet policies failed, Pharaoh chose something far more direct. The order went out across Egypt, no longer whispered to midwives in private chambers, but spoken openly as royal command. Every Hebrew boy who is born must be thrown into the Nile. Not killed in secret. Not hidden away. Thrown into the river. The same river that sustained Egypt's life would now become an instrument of fear. To understand the weight of that decree, you have to understand the Nile itself. The river was not merely a geographic feature. For Egyptians, it was sacred. The annual flooding of the Nile brought fertile soil that fed the entire civilization. Egyptian hymns praised the river as a gift from the gods, especially the deity Hapi, the spirit believed to control its life-giving waters. Farmers depended on it. Cities grew beside it. Priests honored it in temple rituals. And now Pharaoh had turned that sacred river into a weapon against a population living within his borders. Imagine the atmosphere in Goshen after that command spread. Word traveling from family to family. Parents whispering warnings. Pregnant mothers carry not only the weight of a child, but the dread of what might happen if that child were a boy. The Nile flowed quietly as it always had, winding through marshlands and canals of the eastern delta. Fishermen cast nets. Farmers drew irrigation water into their fields. But for the Hebrew community, the river now carried another meaning. It had become a place of danger. This moment marks one of the darkest points in the early Exodus story. The conflict between Pharaoh and Israel is no longer about labor quotas or economic control. It has crossed into something closer to extermination. And yet the narrative does something remarkable. It does not dwell on Pharaoh's power. Instead, it shifts focus to an ordinary household. A man from the tribe of Levi marries a woman also from the tribe of Levi. Later Jewish tradition preserved their names, Amram and Jochebed. They are not political leaders. They are not warriors. Just parents living under a terrifying decree. When their child is born, they see immediately that he is a boy. And according to the royal command, that child should not survive. But the story begins with an act of quiet defiance. Jochebed hides the baby. For 3 months she manages to keep him out of sight. In a crowded community under the watch of Egyptian officials, that could not have been easy. Babies cry, neighbors talk, rumors spread. Eventually, she reaches the moment every parent in that situation feared, the moment when hiding is no longer possible. So she makes a desperate decision. She builds a small basket. The Hebrew word used in Exodus for this basket is unusual. It appears only one other time in the Bible, in the story of Noah's Ark in the book of Genesis. In both cases, the word refers to a protective vessel coated with pitch to keep water out. Ancient readers noticed that connection immediately. Two stories, two waters, two fragile vessels preserving life in the middle of danger. Jochebed coats the basket with bitumen and pitch, sealing it against the river water. Then she places the baby inside and sets the basket among the reeds along the banks of the Nile. Imagine that moment. The quiet movement of the river. Tall reeds shifting in the breeze. A mother stepping away from the small floating basket that now carries her child. Nearby, the baby's sister, later identified as Miriam, watches from a distance, waiting to see what will happen. The Nile had become a place where Hebrew children were meant to die. But on this day, the river will carry one child somewhere unexpected. Because not far from those reeds, members of the Egyptian royal household are approaching the water. Among them is Pharaoh's daughter. Royal women in ancient Egypt often visited the Nile for ritual bathing or leisure near palace gardens along the riverbanks. Servants accompanied them, attending to clothing, perfumes, and ceremonial items. As the princess walks along the water's edge, she notices something unusual among the reeds. A basket. She sends one of her attendants to retrieve it. Inside the basket is a crying infant. The princess immediately understands what she is looking at. This is one of the Hebrew children her father's decree was meant to destroy. And yet something stops her. The book of Exodus describes the moment simply. She had compassion on him. That one decision changes everything. The child who was meant to vanish into the Nile will instead be lifted out of it, into the protection of Pharaoh's own household. Even more surprising, the child's sister Miriam steps forward with remarkable courage and suggests that a Hebrew woman could nurse the baby for the princess. The royal daughter agrees. And so, in one of the most ironic turns in the entire story, the child returns to his own mother Jochebed, who now cares for him under royal protection. The boy grows. Eventually, he is brought back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts him as her son. And she gives him a name: Moses. The explanation preserved in Exodus is poetic. I drew him out of the water. But the name also echoes Egyptian language. Names like Thutmose and Amos were common among Egyptian royalty, where the element Mos meant born of or drawn from. Moses grows up with a name that sits between two worlds. Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, raised in the palace of the very empire that enslaved his people. At this point, no one knows what that will mean for the future. Not Pharaoh, not the princess, not even Moses himself, but the child who floated in a fragile basket among the reeds of the Nile will one day return to that same river. And when he does, Egypt will never be the same. The child who should have died in the Nile grew up inside the house of the man who ordered his death. It is one of the great ironies in ancient history. A Hebrew infant, hidden among the reeds of the Delta, now walks the halls of Egypt's ruling elite. The princess who rescued him raises him as her own son. The biblical text simply calls her Pharaoh's daughter, but Jewish traditions later tried to preserve her identity. Some ancient writings, including traditions recorded by Josephus, give her the name Thermuthes. Rabbinic texts sometimes refer to her as Bethiah, meaning daughter of Yah. Whether these names reflect historical memory or later reflection is uncertain, but they reveal something important. Jewish readers remembered her as the woman who saved Israel's future. Because without her compassion, the story of Exodus would have ended in the reeds of the Nile. The boy grows up in Egypt's royal environment. Imagine what that meant. The royal court of Egypt during the New Kingdom was one of the most sophisticated centers of power in the ancient world. Pharaoh ruled from vast palace complexes surrounded by scribes, military officers, priests, and administrators who managed the empire's vast territories. Foreign ambassadors came from cities like Byblos, Ugarit, and Tyre, bringing gifts and negotiating trade agreements. Military campaigns extended Egypt's influence north into Canaan, and sometimes as far as the Euphrates River. And in the middle of this world grows a boy who was born among slaves. If Moses received the education typical for someone raised in the royal household, he would have learned the language of Egyptian administration. He would have been trained to read hieroglyphs and the simplified script known as hieratic, used by scribes for daily records. Egyptian education also included mathematics, diplomacy, and military strategy. Centuries later, the Book of Acts in the New Testament reflects on Moses' upbringing with a fascinating line. He was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That statement is not exaggerated. Egyptian knowledge in that era was extensive. Medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus described treatments for illnesses. Architectural knowledge allowed engineers to construct massive temples and cities. Astronomers observed the movement of stars to maintain the Egyptian calendar. Moses grows up surrounded by this intellectual world. Yet the question remains, did he know who he was? The book of Exodus does not describe Moses' childhood in detail, but ancient interpreters were deeply curious about it. Jewish writers like Philo of Alexandria, living in the great intellectual center of Alexandria during the 1st century, imagined Moses as a gifted student who excelled in Egyptian learning, but never lost awareness of his Hebrew identity. Philo described him studying philosophy, military science, and leadership, preparing him for a role far beyond that of a palace official. Other traditions emphasize the quiet influence of Moses' birth family. Remember, during his earliest months, and possibly longer, he was nursed and cared for by his own mother Jochebed before being brought fully into the royal household. Those early years matter. A mother can pass down stories long before a child understands politics. Stories about Abraham leaving Ur. Stories about Isaac on Mount Moriah. Stories about Joseph, the brother who rose to power in Egypt generations earlier. Even if Moses later lived among Egyptian nobles, those early memories may have shaped his understanding of who he was. An identity, once planted deeply enough, does not disappear easily. Now imagine Moses as a young man walking through the cities of Egypt. The capital region in the Nile Delta bustles with activity. Trade caravans arrive with cedar wood from Lebanon and copper from the mines of Timnah near the Araba Valley. Priests conduct rituals in temples dedicated to gods like Amun, Ra, and Ptah. Egypt sees itself as the center of the ordered world. Foreign lands beyond its borders are often depicted in Egyptian art as chaotic places, needing the stabilizing authority of Pharaoh. But Moses knows something the Egyptian court does not. He is not Egyptian. His people are the laborers working the brick fields. His relatives live in Goshen, under the authority of overseers who answer to the palace where he now resides. This creates a strange tension. He belongs to two worlds. Raised with privilege, connected by blood to a population living under oppression. And eventually, that tension becomes impossible to ignore. The book of Exodus describes the turning point with quiet simplicity. One day, Moses goes out to look at the burdens of his people. The wording is important. He does not stumble upon the situation by accident. He goes out deliberately. He wants to see what life looks like beyond the walls of the palace. What he finds there will change the course of his life, and eventually the fate of Egypt itself. At some point, curiosity turned into confrontation. The palace walls of Egypt could hide many things. Inside them were gardens, decorated halls, pools reflecting painted columns, and corridors where scribes carried scrolls and officials discussed matters of empire. A man raised in that environment might easily forget the world beyond it. But Moses did not forget. The book of Exodus tells us that he went out to see the burdens of his people. The phrase carries a sense of intention. He was not wandering the streets as a careless noble. He was looking. Perhaps he traveled toward the construction zones near Pithom or the administrative centers around the eastern delta. Archaeological studies of Egyptian labor sites show that these places were busy and tightly supervised. Workers moved mud bricks in lines. Supervisors recorded production levels. Overseers carried staffs used not only for direction, but sometimes for punishment. This was the world Moses stepped into. And what he saw disturbed him. An Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew worker. The scene itself was not unusual in the context of ancient labor systems. Harsh discipline was common in large state projects. Egyptian tomb paintings show supervisors standing over workers to enforce production quotas. But what Moses saw was not just an act of discipline. He saw violence directed at someone he recognized as his own. Now pause for a moment and imagine the tension in that instant. Moses stands between two identities. On one side, the authority of Egypt, the system that raised him, educated him, and gave him status. On the other side, the people who share his blood. The book of Exodus describes what happens next in a few brief lines, but the emotional weight behind them is enormous. Moses looks around. He sees no one nearby. And he strikes the Egyptian. The overseer dies. Then Moses hides the body in the sand. The moment is sudden, almost shocking in its simplicity. There is no speech, no declaration, no dramatic buildup. Just action. Ancient interpreters wrestled with this scene for centuries. Philo of Alexandria described Moses as a man whose sense of justice overcame his restraint. Later rabbinic writings sometimes imagine the act as an attempt to defend the oppressed rather than a calculated rebellion. The New Testament even reflects on this moment. In the book of Acts, Stephen, speaking before the council in Jerusalem, suggests that Moses believed his fellow Hebrews would recognize that God was beginning to deliver them through him. But if that thought existed in Moses' mind, the reality turned out very different. The next day, Moses returns to the same area. This time he sees two Hebrews fighting each other. He steps in to break up the conflict, asking the man in the wrong why he is striking his fellow Hebrew. And suddenly, the entire situation turns against him. The man responds with a chilling question. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Then comes the line that must have hit Moses like a blow. Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? In that moment, Moses realizes something. His secret is not a secret. Someone saw. Word has spread. The palace will hear about it soon. The man who grew up under Pharaoh's protection has now committed murder against an Egyptian official. That is not a mistake the royal court will overlook. The text of Exodus confirms the danger immediately. When Pharaoh hears of the incident, he seeks to kill Moses. The situation has flipped completely. Moses is no longer a prince in Pharaoh's household. He is now a fugitive. Imagine the speed at which that change would have unfolded. One day walking through the palace as a member of the royal household. The next day running for his life across the desert. His destination lies east of Egypt, beyond the Nile Delta, past the military outposts that guarded the frontier routes. He would likely travel through the wilderness roads of the Sinai Peninsula, the same rugged region that centuries earlier caravans had used when moving between Egypt and the Levant. But Moses is not heading toward Canaan. Instead, he travels farther south and east, into a region known as Midian. Midian lay along the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba, stretching into areas that today belong to northwestern Saudi Arabia. In the ancient world, it was home to nomadic tribes who moved livestock across desert pastures and controlled important caravan routes connecting Arabia to the wider Near Eastern trade network. It was a place far from Pharaoh's authority, a place where an Egyptian prince could disappear. By the time Moses reaches Midian, everything he once knew is gone. His position, his education at court, his future in Egypt's political system. All of it left behind in the dust of the desert road. He arrives as a refugee. And yet, strangely enough, this exile will become the place where his real story begins. Because somewhere in the wilderness beyond Midian's rocky valleys, a mountain waits. A mountain where fire will burn without consuming. And where the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will speak again. Exile has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. For Moses, the road out of Egypt did not lead to a new palace or a new court. It led into the rough landscapes east of the Sinai Peninsula, across barren valleys where wind carved shapes into the desert hills. His destination was Midian. Midian was not a centralized kingdom like Egypt. It was a region inhabited by tribal groups who lived along caravan routes connecting Arabia, the Red Sea, and the wider Near Eastern world. Their settlements were scattered near wells and seasonal pastures, and their wealth often depended on livestock, sheep, goats, and camels that could survive in dry terrain. To someone raised among Egyptian temples and palaces, Midian must have felt like another world. The book of Exodus introduces Moses, new life through a scene at a well. In the ancient Near East, wells were more than water sources. They were gathering points, places where travelers stopped and local shepherds brought their animals to drink. Stories in the book of Genesis often unfold at wells, Abraham's servant meeting Rebekah, Jacob encountering Rachel near Haran. Now Moses arrives at a well in Midian. And once again, conflict appears almost immediately. 7 daughters of a Midianite priest come to draw water for their father's flock, but other shepherds push them aside, driving their animals forward and disrupting the women's work. Moses intervenes. The pattern feels familiar. He cannot watch injustice without reacting. Just as he once defended a Hebrew laborer in Egypt, he now stands up for these women in the wilderness. He drives away the aggressive shepherds and helps water the flock. The daughters returned home earlier than expected. Their father notices immediately. The priest of Midian is named Reuel, though later passages also call him Jethro. Scholars have debated whether these names refer to the same man or represent titles within the tribe, but the biblical narrative treats him as Moses, future father-in-law, and an important figure in Midianite society. When the daughters explain what happened at the well, Reuel asks a practical question. Why did you leave the man there? They bring Moses to their home. and the Egyptian fugitive finds something he has not had since leaving Goshen: shelter. Time passes. Moses marries one of Reuel's daughters, Zipporah. They begin a family, and Moses takes on a new role: not prince, not court official, not revolutionary. A shepherd. For someone raised in the royal courts of Egypt, shepherding would have been a dramatic change in status. Egyptian culture often viewed shepherds with disdain. In Genesis, the brothers of Joseph even describe shepherding as something Egyptians considered detestable. Yet here Moses is, spending his days guiding animals across rocky slopes, watching weather patterns, searching for pasture, and protecting flocks from predators. Years pass. Then decades. The man who once walked the corridors of Pharaoh's palace becomes a quiet figure moving through the deserts of Midian. It would be easy to assume his earlier life was finished. Easy to believe that the failed attempt to defend his people had ended whatever future he might have had in Egypt. And perhaps Moses himself thought the same. But history rarely unfolds the way people expect. While Moses lives in Midian, the situation in Egypt continues to deteriorate for the Israelites. The book of Exodus gives us a brief but powerful glimpse of that suffering. The people groan under their slavery. Their cries rise upward. The text describes God remembering his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That language of remembrance is important. It does not mean God had forgotten and suddenly recalled something. In the Hebrew tradition, remembering often means acting in faithfulness to a promise already made. The covenant spoken centuries earlier in the land of Canaan still matters. The descendants of Abraham are still in Egypt, and their suffering has reached a point that will no longer remain unanswered. Meanwhile, far away in Midian, Moses continues his routine. Day after day, he leads flocks across the rugged terrain near the mountains of the region. The Bible identifies one particular place as Horeb, the mountain of God. Later, it will often be called Mount Sinai. Mountains in the ancient world were frequently seen as meeting places between heaven and earth. Temples were sometimes built on high places for that reason. Egyptian religion had sacred mountains associated with the rising of the sun. Canaanite traditions placed divine encounters on peaks like Mount Zaphon. Now Moses is about to experience something similar, but not through a temple, not through a priestly ritual, through something far stranger. One ordinary day while tending the flock, he notices a bush burning on the mountainside. In the desert, small fires were not unusual. Dry brush could ignite easily under intense heat. But this fire behaves differently. The flames rise from the bush, yet the branches do not burn away. The bush remains intact. Moses turns aside to examine it more closely. And as he approaches, a voice calls his name from the fire. Moses, Moses. The exile who thought his life had moved on from Egypt is about to discover something astonishing. The God of his ancestors has not forgotten him. And the wilderness of Midian is about to become the starting point of a confrontation that will shake the entire empire of Egypt. There are moments in history when everything changes quietly. No armies moving. No kings issuing decrees. Just a single person standing in the wrong place, or perhaps the right place, at the right moment. For Moses, that moment comes on the slopes of a mountain called Horeb. The terrain there is harsh. Jagged ridges cut across the desert landscape, and dry winds move through valleys where little grows except tough desert shrubs. Shepherds often bring flocks into these regions during certain seasons, searching for patches of grazing land hidden among the rocky hills. Moses had walked this terrain many times before. For decades he had lived in Midian, guiding the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. The man who once moved through Egyptian palaces now spent his days watching sheep wander across quiet desert slopes. Routine had settled into his life. Morning light over the hills, dust rising under the hooves of animals, the long silence of desert afternoons. It was a simple life, far from Pharaoh's court, far from the brick fields of Goshen, far from the memory of the man he had killed in Egypt. And perhaps Moses believed that part of his life was finished. But something strange appears on the mountain. A bush burning with fire. At first the sight might not seem extraordinary. Dry desert plants can ignite quickly. A lightning strike or intense heat could start a small fire. But this one behaves differently. The flames burn. Yet the bush itself is not consumed. The branches do not blacken. The leaves do not crumble into ash. It burns and continues burning. Moses notices immediately. The book of Exodus preserves his reaction in a line that almost sounds casual. I will turn aside to see this great sight. But the decision to turn aside is the turning point of the story. He walks closer, closer to the fire, closer to something he does not yet understand. And then a voice calls out from the flames. Moses, Moses. In ancient Near Eastern storytelling, repetition of a name often signals urgency and intimacy. The same pattern appears later when God calls Samuel in the temple at Shiloh, and when Jesus speaks to Martha in the Gospel of Luke. Here on the mountain of Horeb, the voice speaks again. Do not come closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. That command would have made immediate sense to someone raised in the religious world of the ancient Near East. Removing sandals was a sign of reverence. Sacred spaces required humility. But this moment is unusual. There is no temple here, no altar, no priestly ritual, just a shepherd and a burning bush in the desert. Yet the voice declares the ground itself holy. Then the speaker identifies himself. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The words connect Moses directly to the ancient stories he must have heard growing up. Stories from Genesis. Stories about a man called Abraham who once left the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. Stories about Isaac in the land of Canaan. Stories about Jacob wrestling beside the Jabbok River. The God of those stories is now speaking again. Moses reacts immediately. He hides his face. The instinct is ancient and deeply human. In many traditions across the ancient world, encountering the divine was dangerous. People believed that seeing a god directly could mean death. So Moses lowers his eyes. And the voice continues. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. Notice the wording carefully. Not a people. Not those slaves. My people. The God speaking from the fire claims the Israelites as his own. The voice continues, describing what has been happening in Egypt. He has heard their cries. He knows their suffering. And he intends to act. Then comes a line that ancient Jewish readers love to reflect on. I have come down to deliver them. That phrase echoes through later biblical writings. It appears again in moments when God intervenes in human history, whether in judgment or rescue. The God who spoke to Abraham centuries earlier has not disappeared. He has been watching, waiting, and now the time for action has arrived. But the next sentence changes everything for Moses. Because the plan does not involve God acting alone. Instead, the voice says something unexpected. I will send you to Pharaoh. Think about that for a moment. Moses fled Egypt as a wanted man. Pharaoh once tried to kill him. And now, standing barefoot before a burning bush in the wilderness of Sinai, he hears a command that sounds impossible. He is supposed to go back. Back to the empire he escaped. Back to the palace he once knew. Back to the king whose authority stretched across the Nile. The quiet life of a shepherd is about to end. And the man who thought his story with Egypt was finished will soon walk into Pharaoh's court again. But this time he will not come alone. The God who spoke to Abraham is going with him. The command hangs in the air on the slopes of Horeb. I will send you to Pharaoh. For a moment, the desert is silent again. Imagine what must have moved through Moses' mind in that instant. 40 years earlier, he had fled Egypt as a fugitive. The empire he once belonged to had become the place he escaped from. The man who had grown up in Pharaoh's court was now an aging shepherd standing barefoot on desert rock. And now the voice from the burning bush tells him to go back. Not quietly, not secretly, but openly into the royal court, to confront the most powerful ruler in the region. Moses responds exactly the way most people would. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? It is not merely fear speaking, it is realism. Egypt's kings commanded armies. Their authority extended through cities like Memphis, Thebes, and the great administrative centers of the Nile Delta. Their chariots moved through Canaan during military campaigns, and their monuments celebrated victories over foreign rulers. What could a desert shepherd possibly say to a king like that? The answer the voice gives is surprisingly simple. I will be with you. Not a detailed strategy. Not a military plan. Just a promise of presence. And then something else is revealed. When Moses brings the Israelites out of Egypt, they will return to this same mountain. Horeb Sinai. The place of the burning bush will one day become the meeting place between God and an entire nation. But Moses is not finished asking questions. In fact, he raises one that cuts straight to the center of identity. When I go to the Israelites and say, "The God of your fathers has sent me," they will ask me his name. What shall I say? In the ancient world, names carried enormous significance. A name was not simply a label. It revealed character, authority, identity. Egyptian gods had names tied to their roles: Ra, the sun god who ruled the sky; Osiris, lord of the underworld; Isis, divine mother and protector. Even the God of Israel had been known by titles in the stories of Genesis. El Shaddai, El Elyon. But here on the mountain, something deeper is revealed. The voice answers with words that have echoed through centuries of theology and debate. I am who I am. In Hebrew, the phrase is connected to the name YHWH, often rendered in English as Yahweh or represented in many translations as the Lord. The meaning is layered. Some ancient Jewish teachers understood it as a declaration of God's eternal existence, the one who simply is. Others saw it as a promise of faithfulness, the God who will be present with his people. Early Christian thinkers also reflected on the phrase. Writers like Augustine in North Africa saw it as a glimpse into the mystery of divine being itself. But for Moses, standing before the bush, the meaning was immediate. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not a distant memory. He was alive, active, and about to intervene in Egypt. The voice continues with instructions. Moses must gather the elders of Israel and tell them that the God of their ancestors has seen what is happening in Egypt. Together, They will approach Pharaoh and ask permission to travel into the wilderness for a 3-day journey to worship. But the voice makes something clear. Pharaoh will refuse. That refusal is not a possibility, it is expected. The confrontation will not end with a simple request granted by a cooperative king. Instead, the story will unfold through a series of events that will force Egypt to confront the power of the God speaking from the bush. The text of Exodus hints at what is coming. God says he will stretch out his hand and strike Egypt with wonders. The word wonders carries a sense of supernatural acts that disrupt the normal order of the world. Later readers would recognize these events as the plagues of Egypt. But Moses is not thinking about plagues yet. He is thinking about himself. His doubts return. What if they do not believe me? It is a fair question. The Israelites have lived under Egyptian control for generations. Their lives are defined by labor quotas and overseers. A man arriving from the desert claiming to speak for the God of their ancestors might sound unlikely. So the voice gives Moses signs. He throws his staff on the ground. It becomes a snake. He picks it up again. It returns to wood. He places his hand inside his cloak. When he pulls it out, the skin has turned white with disease. When he repeats the action, the hand is restored. These signs are not random. In Egypt, serpents symbolized royal authority. Pharaoh's crown often carried the image of the uraeus cobra, representing divine protection and kingship. Now Moses holds a staff that can become a serpent. The symbolism would not be lost on Egyptian observers. The quiet shepherd is being equipped for a confrontation with the empire. Yet even after witnessing these signs, Moses hesitates. He raises one more objection. I am not a good speaker. This admission feels deeply human. Egyptian court culture valued eloquence. Diplomacy and royal negotiation required precise language and confidence. Moses knows the kind of man who normally stands before Pharaoh, and he does not see himself fitting that role. But the answer from the bush carries a sharp reminder. Who made the human mouth? The voice that called Abraham, guided Joseph, and watched Israel's suffering is not intimidated by Pharaoh's court. And now that voice is calling Moses to step into the center of the story. Whether Moses feels ready or not. Because the quiet years of exile in Midian are ending. And the desert shepherd will soon begin the journey back to Egypt. Moses had run out of arguments. One by one, his objections had been answered on the slopes of Horeb. The God speaking from the burning bush had promised presence, revealed a name, given signs, and explained what would happen when Moses returned to Egypt. Still, Moses hesitated. Finally, he said the thing that had been building inside him from the beginning. Please send someone else. It is one of the most honest moments in the entire story. Not heroic, not dramatic, just human. Standing before a mysterious fire on a mountain in the wilderness, Moses admits what many people feel when faced with a calling larger than themselves. He does not want the responsibility. The text of Exodus says something unusual at this point. The anger of the Lord burned against Moses. Not the anger of rejection, but the frustration of a mission being delayed by fear. Yet even in that moment, the solution is practical. Moses will not go alone. The voice reminds him of someone he already knows. His brother Aaron. Aaron is still in Egypt among the Israelites, and the text says he is skilled in speaking. He will serve as Moses' spokesman, explaining the message while Moses performs the signs God has given him. The partnership forms immediately. Moses will carry the authority of the calling. Aaron will carry the words. Together they will stand before Pharaoh. The arrangement reflects a pattern that appears many times in biblical history. Leaders rarely act completely alone. David had advisors in Jerusalem. The prophets often traveled with disciples, and even Jesus later sent his followers out in pairs throughout Galilee and Judea. The work of confronting empires is rarely a one-person task. The voice gives Moses final instructions. He must take the staff with him. The same staff that turned into a serpent will become a symbol of authority throughout the events that follow. Then the fire fades from the narrative. The bush had burned without being consumed. The voice had spoken. Now Moses must act. He returns to the camp of Jethro in Midian and explains that he must travel back to Egypt to see whether his people are still alive. The explanation is simple, almost understated. The full story of the burning bush may have been too difficult to explain in a single conversation. Jethro gives his blessing. Go in peace. And so the shepherd prepares to leave the desert life he has known for decades. Before departing, Moses gathers his family, his wife Zipporah and their sons, and begins the journey westward. The road will lead through the dry wilderness routes that connect Midian to the Sinai Peninsula, eventually descending toward the fertile plains of the Nile Delta. But before he arrives in Egypt, something unexpected happens. The book of Exodus records a strange and mysterious episode during the journey. At a lodging place along the way, Moses suddenly faces a crisis involving covenant and obedience. The details are brief, but the story centers around the ancient practice of circumcision, the sign of the covenant first given to Abraham in Genesis 17. Zipporah quickly performs the ritual for their son, resolving the crisis and preserving Moses' mission. Ancient interpreters debated this passage for centuries. Jewish commentators often saw it as a reminder that the covenant identity of Israel must remain intact, even for the man chosen to lead the nation's deliverance. The lesson is subtle but important. The Exodus story is not simply about escaping oppression. It is about covenant identity. The people leaving Egypt are not just refugees. They are heirs of promises first spoken generations earlier. With the crisis resolved, Moses continues his journey toward Egypt. Meanwhile, back in the land he fled decades earlier, something else is happening. Aaron receives a message from God telling him to go into the wilderness to meet his brother. The meeting takes place near the mountain of God, likely the same region around Horeb where the burning bush appeared. Two brothers, separated by years and geography, embrace in the desert. Moses tells Aaron everything. The words spoken from the bush. The name revealed in the fire. The signs given for the confrontation with Pharaoh. Aaron listens carefully. Then the two men begin the journey together toward the land of Goshen, where the Israelites still labor under Egyptian control. When they arrive, they gather the elders of Israel. Aaron speaks to the people, explaining that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has seen their suffering. Moses performs the signs. The staff becomes a serpent. His hand becomes diseased and then restored. The elders watch in silence. Then something remarkable happens. The people believe. The text says that when they hear that God has seen their suffering, they bow their heads in worship. For generations, they had lived under Egyptian rule. Now, for the first time, a new possibility begins to take shape in their minds. Deliverance. But belief among the people is only the first step. The real confrontation lies ahead. Because the next place Moses and Aaron must go is the one building that represents the power of Egypt itself, the royal court of Pharaoh. And when they step into that court, the quiet story that began with a baby in a basket will turn into a conflict that shakes an empire. Every empire eventually faces a moment when someone challenges its authority. Sometimes it is an army gathering on a distant border. Sometimes a rival king rises in another city. But occasionally, the challenge arrives in a much quieter form. Two men walking into a royal court. That is how the next stage of the Exodus story begins. Moses and Aaron enter the presence of Pharaoh. The palace they step into is not merely a residence. Egyptian royal courts were political and religious centers at the same time. Pharaoh ruled not only as king, but as the divine representative of the gods on earth. His authority maintained the cosmic balance Egyptians believed kept the universe stable. To challenge Pharaoh was not simply to question a political leader. It was to challenge the entire structure of Egyptian order. Imagine the setting. Columns painted with images of lotus flowers and papyrus plants rise toward the ceiling. Walls display relief carvings showing Pharaoh conquering foreign enemies from Canaan, Nubia, and lands beyond the Euphrates. Officials move through the hall, scribes carrying tablets, priests maintaining ritual purity, military commanders standing beside the throne. Into this environment walk two men from the desert. One carries a shepherd's staff. The other prepares to speak. Aaron delivers the message exactly as it was given. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, so they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness. The request sounds simple. A 3-day journey. A time of worship. But the wording contains something far more provocative. Thus says the Lord. In ancient diplomacy, messages between rulers often followed that pattern. A messenger would declare the authority behind the message before delivering the demand. Yet here the authority being invoked is not a foreign king. It is YHWH, the God of Israel. Pharaoh's reaction is immediate. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? The question is not merely defiance. It reflects genuine confusion. Egyptian religion included many gods, Ra, Amun, Horus, Ptah, and dozens more. Each had temples, priests, and established rituals across the land. But the God of a slave population living in Goshen. Pharaoh sees no reason to recognize that authority. I do not know the Lord, he replies, and I will not let Israel go. The response closes the door instantly. But Moses and Aaron try again. They repeat the request, explaining that the God of the Hebrews has met with them and warning that refusal could bring consequences. Pharaoh hears something different. In his mind, the request confirms a suspicion he already had. The Israelites are becoming restless. Too much time. Too much freedom to think. Too much talk about leaving Egypt. His solution is harsh and immediate. The same day, Pharaoh issues a new command to the overseers supervising Israelite labor. The workload will increase. Until now, Egyptian administrators had supplied the straw needed for brick production. Straw strengthened the mud mixture, allowing bricks to hold their shape while drying in the sun. Now the Israelites must gather the straw themselves. The daily quota of bricks remains exactly the same. Imagine the effect. Workers who once spent their time shaping bricks must now search fields and marshes for scattered plant stalks before beginning the same amount of construction work. The demand is mathematically impossible. But Pharaoh intends it that way. His reasoning appears bluntly in the text of Exodus. They are lazy. In Pharaoh's mind, the request for religious freedom proves that the Hebrews have too much time on their hands. Harder labor will solve that problem. The command spreads quickly through the labor camps of Goshen. Egyptian overseers enforce the new rule. Hebrew foremen, leaders within the labor crews, are beaten when quotas are not met. The situation deteriorates almost immediately. Workers scatter across the delta fields, gathering bits of straw wherever they can find it. Production slows. Punishment increases. Soon the Hebrew foremen take a desperate step. They approach Pharaoh themselves. Standing before the same throne where Moses and Aaron had spoken earlier, they plead their case. Why do you treat your servants this way? Straw is no longer given to us, yet we are told to make bricks. But Pharaoh refuses to reconsider. He repeats his accusation. You are idle. The foremen leave the palace knowing the truth. The situation has just become worse. And they know exactly who to blame. When they see Moses and Aaron waiting outside the palace, their frustration explodes. May the Lord judge you, they say. You have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh. Think about that moment. The deliverers who promised freedom have just made life harder. Instead of relief, the people now face increased suffering. The first confrontation with Pharaoh has ended in failure. Or at least that is how it appears. But the story unfolding in Egypt is larger than a single meeting in the royal court. Because Pharaoh has just asked a question that will soon be answered in ways he cannot imagine. Who is the Lord? Egypt is about to find out. The reaction of the Hebrew foreman spreads quickly through the camps of Goshen. Anger, confusion, a sense of betrayal. For generations, the Israelites had lived under Egyptian control. Their lives were difficult, but at least the system was predictable. They knew the rhythm of the work, the demands of the overseers, the boundaries of their suffering. Then Moses arrived. He spoke of deliverance. He spoke of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remembering his people. For a brief moment hope had flickered. And now the situation is worse than before. Brick quotas remain the same, but the straw that once came from Egyptian supply stores was gone. Workers spread across the delta fields searching for scraps of dry stalks. Production slowed and punishment increased. Egyptian overseers beat the Hebrew foremen responsible for meeting the quotas. The anger of the workers now turns toward Moses. You have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh, the foremen tell him. You have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Imagine the weight of those words. Moses had returned to Egypt believing he was carrying a message of liberation. Instead, the first result of his mission had intensified the suffering of his own people. It is one thing to confront an empire. It is another to watch the people you hope to help suffer because of it. So Moses does something that runs throughout the biblical story whenever leaders reach the limits of their strength. He turns back to God. The book of Exodus records his prayer in raw language. Lord, why have you brought trouble upon these people? Then a second question follows. Why did you send me? There is no polished theology here, no formal prayer structure. Just frustration. Moses describes the situation exactly as he sees it. Since the moment he spoke to Pharaoh, the oppression has grown worse. The deliverance promised has not appeared. Ancient readers were often struck by the honesty of this exchange. Later prophets would speak to God in similar ways. Jeremiah, centuries later in Jerusalem, would cry out about injustice in his own time. The Psalms contain prayers filled with confusion and protest. Faith in the biblical tradition, does not eliminate difficult questions. It often brings them into the open. God's response to Moses does not begin with an explanation. Instead, it begins with a promise. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh." The phrase carries a quiet confidence. The confrontation with Egypt has only just begun. Then the message expands. God reminds Moses of the covenant spoken centuries earlier to Abraham, later reaffirmed to Isaac and Jacob in the land of Canaan. Those promises included descendants, land, and a relationship between God and Abraham's family that would shape history. Now the descendants of that family are living under slavery in Egypt. But the covenant still stands. The text introduces the divine name again, YHWH, connecting the moment at the burning bush with the unfolding events in Egypt. Ancient Jewish teachers paid careful attention to this section. Some rabbinic writings suggest that the patriarchs of Genesis knew God primarily through promises, while Moses would know him through acts of power that fulfilled those promises. In other words, Abraham heard about the future. Moses is about to see it begin. God describes what will happen using a series of powerful statements. "I will bring you out. I will free you. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you as my people." The language moves beyond simple escape. This is not just a labor dispute between workers and the Egyptian state. It is a transformation of identity. The Israelites will move from being slaves under Pharaoh to becoming a people connected to the God who speaks from the burning bush. And that relationship carries enormous implications. The phrase, "I will take you as my people," echoes later throughout the Bible. It appears in prophetic writings centuries later and even resonates in the final pages of the book of Revelation, where the vision of a restored world includes the promise that God will dwell among his people. But for now, the focus remains in Egypt. The message to Moses includes something else, an explanation of the coming conflict. Pharaoh will not release the Israelites easily. His heart will be hardened, and the confrontation will unfold through a series of acts that display God's power in Egypt. The story is beginning to widen. At first it looked like a political dispute, a request for a 3-day journey into the wilderness. Now it becomes clear that something larger is about to happen. The gods of Egypt, the authority of Pharaoh, the identity of Israel, all of it will be drawn into the unfolding events. Moses returns to the Israelites with this message. He tells them that the God of their ancestors has not forgotten them and that deliverance is coming. But the response is painful. The text of Exodus says the people did not listen, not because they rejected God, but because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery. Hope can be difficult to hear when suffering dominates everyday life. For the Israelites, the promise of freedom feels distant compared to the immediate demands of brick production and punishment. Still, the plan is moving forward. Moses must return to Pharaoh again. He objects once more. "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh?" It is a logical question. But the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is no longer dependent on human persuasion alone. Because the next meeting in the royal court will begin something Egypt has never seen before. The river that sustained the entire civilization will soon turn into blood. The next encounter between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh does not begin with negotiation. It begins with a sign. The setting is once again the royal court of Egypt. Officials gather near the throne. Priests of the temples observe the proceedings. Scribes prepare to record anything that might matter in the affairs of the state. Into this room, walked the same two men who had already caused trouble among the Hebrew labor force. Pharaoh is prepared for them. This time he demands proof. Show a miracle. The request fits Egyptian culture well. Signs and wonders were part of the religious imagination of the ancient world. Egyptian priests associated with temples of Amun, Ra, and Horus practiced ritual acts meant to demonstrate divine favor or spiritual authority. If Moses and Aaron claim to speak for a god, Pharaoh expects evidence. Aaron steps forward. He throws the staff onto the ground. Before the eyes of the court, the wood twists and moves. The staff becomes a serpent. For anyone familiar with Egyptian symbolism, the image would have been striking. The cobra, known as the uraeus, appeared on Pharaoh's crown as a symbol of royal power and divine protection. In temple art, the serpent represented authority granted by the gods. Now a staff held by a shepherd has turned into that same symbol. Pharaoh's reaction is calm. He summons his own wise men and magicians, priests trained in Egypt's ritual arts. Ancient Egyptian texts speak of court magicians capable of performing illusions and ceremonial acts connected to religious practice. They perform a similar sign. Their staff also appear to become serpents. For a moment it looks as if the power in the room is evenly matched. But then something happens that shifts the scene. Aaron's serpent moves across the floor and swallows the serpents of the Egyptian magicians. One by one, the symbols of Egyptian power disappear into the mouth of a single snake. The court watches. The message is subtle but unmistakable. The power standing behind Moses is greater. Yet Pharaoh refuses to acknowledge it. The book of Exodus repeats a phrase that will appear many times in the chapters ahead. Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He dismisses the sign. The confrontation continues. Soon after this encounter, Moses and Aaron receive instructions to meet Pharaoh again, this time by the Nile River. The location is not accidental. The Nile was the center of Egypt's life. Every year the river flooded its banks, depositing fertile soil that allowed crops to grow across the narrow green strip of land between desert cliffs. Egyptian hymns celebrated the Nile as the source of prosperity. Priests associated the river with the god Hapi, who controlled the flooding waters. Without the Nile, the entire civilization would collapse. At dawn, Pharaoh walks toward the riverbank. Perhaps he comes for a ritual connected to the morning rise of the sun. Egyptian kings often participated in ceremonies honoring the daily journey of Ra, the sun god. Moses and Aaron are waiting. Aaron raises the staff. He stretches it out over the water. And suddenly, something impossible happens. The Nile turns red. Not just the main river channel. Every connected stream, every irrigation canal, every reservoir is used for storing water. The entire water system of Egypt begins to change. Fish float to the surface, dead. The smell spreads through the air. Water that once sustained the land becomes undrinkable. The scale of the event is enormous. Egypt depended completely on that river system. Cities from Memphis in the north to Thebes in the south relied on the Nile for drinking water, agriculture, transportation, and trade. Now the river itself has become a problem. The text of Exodus describes Egyptians digging along the banks of the river, searching for fresh water underground. Meanwhile, the royal magicians attempt to replicate the phenomenon through their own arts. Somehow they produce a similar effect. Whether through illusion, ritual, or limited manipulation of water sources, they convince Pharaoh that the event does not prove Moses' authority. And once again, Pharaoh refuses to yield. His heart remains hardened. The river slowly returns to normal after 7 days. But the warning has already been delivered. Egypt has experienced the first strike. Ancient Jewish interpreters later noticed something important about the order of the plagues. The confrontation began with the Nile, because the Nile represented Egypt's foundation. Before temples fall, before darkness spreads, before death reaches the royal household, the river itself must be challenged. Pharaoh had asked a simple question earlier in the court. Who is the Lord? The plagues will become the answer. And the next sign will come quickly, because soon the quiet banks of the Nile will erupt with something far stranger than red water. The land of Egypt will begin to crawl with frogs. The plagues did not arrive as a single, overwhelming catastrophe. They came in waves, each one pressing harder than the last. After the Nile turned to blood and the riverbanks filled with the smell of dying fish, Egypt barely had time to recover before the next disturbance began. Frogs. At first they appeared along the edges of the water, where the marshes of the Nile Delta always teemed with life. But soon the numbers became unnatural. Frogs crawled into ovens. Frogs filled sleeping rooms. Frogs appeared inside the palace itself. Egyptian religion had long associated frogs with fertility and birth. The goddess Hecate was often depicted with the head of a frog, connected to the life that emerged each year with the Nile's flooding waters. But now the symbol of life has become unbearable. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. For the first time in the confrontation, Pharaoh offered a partial concession. "Pray to your God," he said, "and I will let the people go." Moses agreed. The frogs died across the land, leaving Egypt with another problem: piles of rotting bodies scattered through the cities. And as soon as the immediate crisis passed, Pharaoh changed his mind. The pattern had begun. The plagues continued. Dust of the earth turned into swarms of gnats that filled the air. Egyptian priests, known for their obsession with ritual cleanliness, suddenly found themselves unable to perform temple duties while insects covered their skin. Then came flies. Dense black clouds moving through cities like Memphis and the administrative centers of the Delta. Markets closed. Livestock panicked. The air itself seemed alive with movement. Egyptian magicians, who had tried to replicate the earlier signs, began to admit something disturbing. This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh did not listen. The confrontation continued. Next came disease among livestock. Horses, cattle, and donkeys died across Egyptian fields. The loss hit both farmers and the military. Egyptian chariots, famous across the ancient Near East, depended heavily on strong horses. Then came boils, painful skin eruptions spreading across people and animals alike. Even the royal magicians who once stood confidently before Pharaoh could no longer stand in Moses' presence because of the sores covering their bodies. Each plague struck at something Egypt depended upon: water, agriculture, animals, health. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The plagues were quietly dismantling the authority of Egypt's religious system. The Nile had been linked to Hapi, frogs connected to Hecate, livestock associated with deities like Hathor. Now each symbol of divine order appeared powerless. Ancient Jewish interpreters later described the plagues as a judgment not only on Pharaoh, but on the gods of Egypt themselves. The book of Exodus even says it directly at one point. God would execute judgment on the gods of Egypt. And yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. His heart hardened again and again. The confrontation escalated. Thunderstorms unlike anything Egypt normally experienced crashed across the land. Hail destroyed crops in the fields near Goshen and farther south along the Nile Valley. Then locusts arrived. The sky darkened as enormous swarms devoured whatever plants had survived the hail. Grain fields disappeared. Trees were stripped bare. Pharaoh again called Moses. Again he asked for relief. Again he hardened his heart once the immediate danger passed. Finally, a darkness settled across Egypt that felt almost supernatural. For 3 days the land was covered in darkness so thick people could not see each other. Lamps barely cut through it. In Egyptian belief, light symbolized the daily triumph of the sun god Ra over chaos. Each morning the rising sun confirmed that order still ruled the world. Now the sun disappeared. The land of the sun god had fallen into shadow. Yet even after all this, Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. At this point the story reaches a strange pause. 9 plagues have shaken the empire. Agriculture, livestock, and religious confidence have all suffered. But the final blow has not yet arrived. And when it does come, it will not fall first on the fields or rivers of Egypt. It will fall inside Egyptian homes. Before that night arrives, however, something else must happen. Because while Egypt prepares for another confrontation, Israel is about to receive a ritual that will shape its identity for thousands of years. A meal, a sacrifice, a night that Jewish families would remember in Jerusalem, Babylon, Alexandria, and eventually across the world. The night is called Passover. And when that night comes, the future of Egypt and Israel will change forever. Before the final plague arrived, something remarkable happened inside the Hebrew community. While Egypt waited in uneasy silence after the darkness that had covered the land, Moses gathered the elders of Israel and delivered a set of instructions unlike anything they had heard before. It was not a warning, not a strategy for rebellion. It was a ritual. The instructions were precise. Each household was to choose a young lamb. The animal had to be without defects, healthy, and in its first year. The families would keep the lamb for several days, then slaughter it at twilight. The blood of the lamb would be placed on the doorposts and the lintel of each house. Inside the homes, the people were to prepare a specific meal. Roasted lamb, bread made without yeast, bitter herbs, and they were to eat it in a very unusual way. Fully dressed, sandals on their feet, staffs in their hands, ready to travel. Imagine the strange atmosphere in Goshen that evening. Families gathering quietly inside mud brick homes, fires burning under clay ovens, the smell of roasted meat filling the narrow streets of the settlements, children asking questions their parents may not fully understand how to answer. Why are we eating like travelers? Why tonight? Why the blood on the door? The ritual carried a promise. That night Moses said, the Lord would pass through the land of Egypt. But the homes marked with blood would be passed over. The name Passover, known in Hebrew as Pesach, would come from that promise. The idea was simple but powerful. The blood marked belonging. Inside those houses lived people under the protection of the God who had spoken to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Outside those doors lay the world of Pharaoh's empire. Jewish tradition would later make this meal one of the most important rituals in its history. Every year, families would gather to retell the story of the Exodus through the Passover Seder, asking questions, reciting prayers, and remembering the night their ancestors left Egypt. But on that first night, the ritual was still new. No one fully understood how deeply it would shape the future. Meanwhile, across the rest of Egypt, life continued almost normally. Farmers repaired damaged fields after the hail and locusts. Officials in cities like Memphis and Pyramuses tried to stabilize the economy after months of disruption. Priests in temples of Amun and Ra performed rituals meant to restore cosmic balance. Perhaps many Egyptians believed the worst was over. 9 plagues had come and gone. The river flowed again. The sky had cleared. Maybe the strange conflict between Pharaoh and the Hebrew God had reached its end. But the final act was about to begin. The book of Exodus describes it with chilling simplicity. At midnight the Lord would strike down every firstborn in Egypt. From the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of prisoners in dungeons, even the firstborn of livestock in the fields. The scope of the event is enormous. In ancient societies, the firstborn son represented the future of a family. He carried inheritance rights, leadership responsibilities, and the continuation of the household. For Pharaoh's own family, the firstborn prince was the heir to the throne of Egypt. The final plague would not strike only the lower classes. It would reach directly into the royal palace. Ancient readers struggled with the severity of this moment. Jewish scholars writing in the centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem often treated the event with solemn reverence, recognizing its gravity, but also emphasizing the years of oppression that preceded it. Christian writers later saw a symbolic connection between this moment and the death of Jesus in Jerusalem during the Passover festival centuries later. In the Gospel accounts, Jesus is described as dying during Passover, and early Christian theology began referring to him as a kind of Passover lamb whose sacrifice brings deliverance. But those later interpretations would come much later. On this first Passover night, the Israelites simply followed the instructions they had been given. Blood on the doorposts. Families gathered. A hurried meal. Outside their homes, the empire of Egypt waited in uneasy silence. Midnight approached, and when it came, the silence would shatter. Because before morning arrived, the entire land of Egypt would hear something it had never heard before. A cry rising from every city along the Nile. From Thebes in the south, to the palace of Pharaoh in the north. A cry that would mark the end of Israel's slavery and the beginning of their journey out of Egypt. Midnight arrived quietly. There was no warning in the sky, no thunder rolling across the Nile Valley, no visible sign that something extraordinary was about to unfold across the cities of Egypt. Inside the homes of the Israelites in Goshen, families remained awake. They had followed Moses' instructions carefully. The lamb had been roasted over the fire. The bread had been baked without yeast, flat, simple loaves prepared quickly because there had been no time to wait for dough to rise. Bitter herbs lay beside the meat, reminding them of the bitterness of their years under slavery. The blood of the lamb marked the doorways. Children sat close to their parents. Everyone was dressed for travel. The staff rested in their hands. They were waiting. Across the rest of Egypt, the night looked ordinary. Torches burned in the courtyards of houses in Memphis, one of the oldest political centers of the kingdom. Guards patrolled near the administrative buildings of Pyramuses, the royal city in the eastern delta. Farther south in Thebes, priests of Amun prepared for the next day's rituals in temple complexes that had stood for centuries. But something invisible moved through the land. The book of Exodus describes it with stark brevity. At midnight the Lord struck down every firstborn in Egypt. The firstborn son of Pharaoh, the firstborn child in the house of servants, the firstborn of prisoners, even the firstborn among livestock. The scale of the moment is almost impossible to imagine. In a single night, grief reached into every layer of Egyptian society. No family remained untouched. And soon the silence of the night broke. A cry rose from the land. Not from one house, from thousands. The sound spread across the Nile Valley, echoing through cities and villages alike. Egypt had known droughts before. It had faced foreign invasions. But nothing like this. The text says there was not a house where someone had not died. Even the royal palace was struck. Pharaoh's own son, the heir to the throne, was gone. The king who had declared himself protector of man, the divine order of the world, now faced a catastrophe that none of Egypt's gods had prevented. The priests of Ra had not stopped it. The temples of Isis had not protected the people. The rituals of Egypt's powerful priesthood had failed. And in the Hebrew homes marked with blood, something equally remarkable had happened. The disaster had passed over them. The lamb's blood had marked a boundary between two worlds. Outside the door, death. Inside, life. This moment would echo through Jewish memory for centuries. The Passover ritual became a yearly reminder that deliverance came not through power or rebellion, but through trust in the God who acted on behalf of his people. In later centuries, Jewish families celebrating Passover in Jerusalem, Babylon, or Alexandria would retell this story with solemn gratitude. But on that first night, the focus remained immediate. Egypt was in chaos. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron before dawn. The message that came from the palace was simple. Leave. Take your people. Take your flocks. Leave the land of Egypt. The king, who had repeatedly hardened his heart, had finally reached the breaking point. Egyptians across the country urged the Israelites to go quickly. They feared that if the Hebrews remained any longer, even more disaster might follow. So the Israelites prepared to depart. The bread they carried remained unleavened because there had been no time for fermentation. Their kneading bowls were wrapped in cloth and carried on their shoulders. But something else happened that night as well. The Egyptians, desperate for peace, gave the departing Israelites gifts: silver, gold, and clothing. The text of Exodus describes this moment almost like a reversal. The people who had once labored under Egyptian masters now left with resources provided by those same households. Then the long-awaited movement began. Families stepped out of their homes in Goshen. Men, women, children, livestock. A population that had grown from the 70 members of Jacob's household centuries earlier now moved together toward the desert roads. Their destination lay east, toward the wilderness, toward a body of water that Egyptian armies would soon approach in pursuit. But for now, the night of Passover had done something extraordinary. It had broken the power of Pharaoh. The empire that once seemed unshakable had finally released its slaves. And as dawn rose over the Nile Delta, a new nation began to walk out of Egypt. Freedom rarely begins with celebration. More often it begins with movement. Before the sun rose fully over the eastern Nile Delta, the Israelites were already on the road. The departure was massive. The book of Exodus gives a number that ancient readers have debated for centuries: about 600,000 men on foot, not counting women and children. Even if the number reflects symbolic language or broader tribal groupings, the scale of the migration is unmistakable. This was no small escape. It was a population on the move. Families gathered their belongings quickly. The bread they carried remained unleavened because there had been no time for fermentation. Dough had been wrapped in cloth and carried in kneading bowls slung over shoulders. Livestock moved with the crowd: sheep, goats, cattle. The descendants of Jacob, once a small clan that entered Egypt during the famine of Joseph's era, had become a vast community. And now that community is leaving. Their first major stopping point was a place called Sukkot. The exact location remains debated by archaeologists, but it likely lay somewhere in the eastern Nile Delta, near the borderlands leading toward the Sinai Peninsula. The name itself means booths, or temporary shelters, suggesting a place where travelers or workers often camped. Imagine the sight: a long procession stretching across dusty roads, children walking beside parents, animals moving slowly through the crowd, the air filled with conversation, uncertainty, and perhaps a strange mixture of excitement and fear. For generations, the Israelites had lived under Egyptian authority. Egypt had defined their world, its cities, its labor systems, its rules. Now they were stepping outside that system for the first time. But the journey ahead was not simple. The most direct road from the Nile Delta to the land of Canaan followed the northern coastal route known later as the Way of the Philistines. This road connected Egyptian garrisons along the Mediterranean coast and passed through cities like Gaza before entering the hill country of Canaan. It was the fastest route, but it was also heavily guarded. Egypt maintained military outposts along that road, and Canaan itself was not an empty land. It was filled with fortified city-states, places like Megiddo, Hazor, and Jericho, each ruled by local kings and connected to the wider political networks of the late Bronze Age. A newly freed population of former slaves would not be ready for immediate warfare. So the route changes. Instead of heading north along the coast, the Israelites moved southeast toward the wilderness regions bordering the Red Sea, or more precisely, the network of lakes and waterways that extended through the eastern edge of the delta. The book of Exodus describes something extraordinary guiding the movement of the people. By day a pillar of cloud, by night a pillar of fire. Ancient readers often understood these images as signs of divine presence, a visible reminder that the God who spoke from the burning bush was now leading the entire nation. In desert regions, such imagery would carry practical meaning as well. Columns of smoke or fire could guide travelers across difficult terrain, marking direction in places where landmarks were few. But the symbolism went deeper. The Israelites had left Egypt behind. Now their journey would be shaped not by Pharaoh's commands, but by the guidance of the God who had delivered them. Another important detail appears in the narrative at this point. Before leaving Egypt, Moses carried something with him: the bones of Joseph. Centuries earlier, Joseph had made his family swear an oath. When God eventually brought their descendants out of Egypt, they were to carry his remains with them back to the land of Canaan. That promise had survived generations. Now, as the people moved through the desert roads east of the Nile, Joseph traveled with them. The man who once saved Egypt during famine would now accompany Israel on its journey toward freedom. The procession continues. From Sukkot, the Israelites travel to Etham, described as a place on the edge of the wilderness. Here the landscape begins to change. The fertile fields of the Nile Delta give way to harsher terrain: rocky plains, scattered shrubs, dry winds moving across open land. The world of Egypt is fading behind them. Ahead lies the desert. But the story takes a surprising turn. Just when it seems the Israelites are moving steadily away from Egyptian territory, God instructs Moses to change direction. Instead of continuing deeper into the wilderness, They are told to camp near the sea, a place identified as Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdal and the sea, opposite a place called Baal-Zephon. To the Israelites, the change may have seemed strange. To Pharaoh, it will look like a mistake, because from the Egyptian perspective, the fleeing population has just trapped itself. With the sea in front of them and desert terrain around them, they appear vulnerable. And when Pharaoh hears about their movement, he will see an opportunity. The king who finally released his slaves during the night of Passover is about to change his mind. And the most powerful army in the region will soon begin moving toward the sea, where the Israelites now stand, waiting. Back in Egypt, the shock of Passover had begun to settle. The cries that filled the night were fading. Families mourned their dead. Priests in the temples struggled to explain what had happened. The palace itself was still recovering from the loss of Pharaoh's heir. But grief does not always produce humility. Sometimes it produces anger. As the days passed, reports reached the royal court. The Israelites had not simply gone into the wilderness to hold a short religious festival. They were leaving. Entire communities were moving east with livestock, families, and possessions. The workforce that had built storage cities like Pithom and Ramesses was disappearing into the desert. Pharaoh began to reconsider. The book of Exodus describes the moment with an almost bitter clarity. Pharaoh and his officials looked at one another and asked the question that now seemed obvious. What have we done, letting Israel go from serving us? The economic impact would have been enormous. Egypt's building projects relied heavily on organized labor forces. Losing a massive workforce overnight meant unfinished construction, disrupted supply chains, and weakened infrastructure in the eastern delta. But there was also pride. Pharaoh had been defied. A population of slaves had walked away. For a king who was believed to embody divine authority, that reality could not stand. So Pharaoh ordered his chariots prepared. Ancient Egypt's military strength depended heavily on chariot forces. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egyptian armies were famous across the Near East for their fast-moving chariot divisions, two-man teams consisting of a driver and an archer, capable of striking quickly across open terrain. Pharaoh gathered 600 of his best chariots. Not ordinary vehicles. Elite units. The strongest military force available. Along with them came the rest of Egypt's chariot corps and supporting troops. Imagine the moment those wheels began moving across the land. Dust rising from the roads of the Nile Delta. Bronze weapons glinting under the Egyptian sun. Commanders shouting orders as horses pulled chariots eastward toward the wilderness frontier. The pursuit had begun. Meanwhile, the Israelites had reached the place where Moses had been instructed to camp. The location described in Exodus is complex. Pi-Hahiroth between Migdal and the sea, facing Baal-Zephon. Scholars have debated these locations for centuries, but the general picture is clear. The Israelites were now near a large body of water along the eastern edge of the delta, often translated as the Red Sea, though the Hebrew phrase Yam Suf may refer to a broader region of marshes, lakes, and sea inlets connected to the northern extension of the Gulf of Suez. The geography mattered. To the Israelites, the water ahead represented an obstacle. To Pharaoh, it looked like a trap. From the Egyptian perspective, the situation was perfect. The fleeing population had placed itself in a vulnerable position. The sea blocked their escape forward, while the desert terrain limited their movement sideways. All Pharaoh needed to do was arrive. Soon dust appeared on the horizon behind the Israelite camp. Someone spotted it first. Then others began to see it too. a rising cloud moving across the land. As the shapes became clearer, fear spread through the camp. Chariots, horses, the army of Egypt. Imagine the panic that followed. Families who had only recently tasted freedom now saw the army that had once controlled their lives approaching rapidly. The same overseers who had beaten them for failing to meet brick quotas were now returning with soldiers. The people turned on Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die in the wilderness? The words are harsh, but they reveal something deeply human. Freedom can be terrifying when the familiar world of oppression suddenly disappears. For generations, the Israelites had lived within Egypt's system. Harsh as it was, it had provided structure. Now they face uncertainty. Behind them, Pharaoh's army. Before them, the sea. Panic filled the camp. Some people began saying something almost unthinkable. It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. The irony is painful. The same people who cried out to God under slavery were now wishing they had never left. Moses stands before them. The man who once doubted his ability to speak now delivers one of the most powerful statements in the Exodus story. Do not be afraid. Then he adds something even more striking. Stand firm, and you will see the salvation of the Lord. He points toward the approaching army. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. At that moment, the situation still looked hopeless. The army was coming. The sea was in front of them. No path of escape was visible. But the confrontation between Pharaoh and the God of Israel had not yet reached its final act. Because what will happen next will become one of the most remembered moments in human storytelling. A moment later sung in ancient Hebrew poetry. Remembered in Jewish liturgy. Echoed centuries later in the book of Revelation, where believers are described as standing beside a sea of glass, singing a song that recalls the victory of Moses. The water before them will not remain an obstacle. Soon it will become a road, and the empire of Egypt will ride straight into it. The fear in the Israelite camp spread quickly. Families gathered their children. Livestock shifted nervously. People climbed small rises in the terrain trying to see the dust cloud approaching from the west. And there was no mistaking what it meant. Pharaoh's army was coming. 600 elite chariots, along with supporting forces, were moving toward the place where the Israelites had stopped beside the sea. In the open terrain of the eastern Nile Delta and the desert frontier beyond it, chariots were devastating weapons. They moved faster than foot soldiers, struck from a distance with arrows, and could scatter large groups of people who had no organized defense. The Israelites had none of that. No army, no weapons, no formation. Just families, animals, and the possessions they had carried out of Goshen. The panic was understandable. But something else happened at that moment. The pillar of cloud that had been guiding the Israelites began to move. Instead of remaining in front of the people, it shifted behind them, placing itself between the camp of Israel and the advancing Egyptian forces. To the Egyptians, the cloud became darkness. To the Israelites, it continued to give light. Night fell across the wilderness frontier. And suddenly the two groups, one desperate, one pursuing, could not reach each other. Ancient Jewish readers later reflected deeply on this moment. Some rabbis described it as the first act of protection before the miracle of the sea itself. The same presence that had appeared in the burning bush was now standing between the people and the army that once ruled them. But the most dramatic moment was still ahead. God spoke to Moses again. Stretch out your hand over the sea. Imagine standing there when that command was given. Behind you, an army waiting in the darkness. In front of you, the wide waters of the sea. Moses walks forward. He lifts the staff, and something begins to happen. The book of Exodus describes a powerful east wind blowing throughout the night. The wind drives the waters back, creating dry ground where the sea had been. The imagery is astonishing. Walls of water rising on both sides. A pathway appears through the sea itself. Whether readers imagine the scene through miraculous intervention, extraordinary natural forces guided by divine timing, or some combination of both, the message in the text is clear. The sea that blocked Israel's path had become their road. Moses steps forward first. Behind him, the people begin to move. Imagine the moment. Thousands of families walked into the space where water once stood. The seabed beneath their feet. Water rising like walls to their right and left. Torches flickering in the wind as people guide children and animals through the dark. The journey takes hours. The entire population must cross. Meanwhile, the Egyptian army watches from the other side. When the cloud lifts and the path through the sea becomes visible, Pharaoh's commanders see what looks like an opportunity. The Israelites are still in the middle of the crossing. The Egyptian chariots charge forward. Horses pulling war chariots descend into the seabed path, following the same road the Israelites have taken. But something begins to go wrong. The text describes confusion spreading among the Egyptian forces. Chariot wheels begin to jam in the wet ground. The soldiers realize the situation is not what they expected. "Let us flee from Israel," some of them say. The Lord fights for them against Egypt. But by then it is too late. The Israelites have reached the other side. God speaks again to Moses. "Stretch out your hand over the sea." Moses raises the staff. The east wind ceases, and the waters begin to return. The walls collapse inward. The sea rushes back into the path where the Egyptian army stands. Chariots overturn. Horses struggle in the rising water. The soldiers who had pursued the Israelites through the sea were swallowed by the returning tide. By morning, the shore is quiet again. The Israelites stand on the far side of the sea. Behind them lies the water that once trapped them. Floating along the shoreline are the remnants of the army that once ruled their lives. The book of Exodus says something profound about this moment. Israel saw the great power the Lord displayed against Egypt, and the people feared the Lord. For the first time, the nation that had lived for generations under Pharaoh's control witnessed a complete break from that past. The empire that once seemed unstoppable had been defeated without a single Israelite weapon. Freedom was no longer a fragile hope. It had become reality. But the story does not end with the destruction of Pharaoh's army. Because what happens next is something rare in ancient texts. The people sing, and their song will become one of the oldest surviving poems in the Bible. A song that celebrates the fall of Egypt and the birth of a nation. Morning light slowly spread across the shoreline. The wind that had howled through the night was gone. The waters of the sea moved again in their natural rhythm, rising and falling against the sand. And on the eastern side of that shoreline stood a people who, only hours earlier, believed they were about to die. The Israelites looked across the water they had just crossed. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the remains of Pharaoh's army, the chariots, horses, and soldiers who had pursued them from the cities of the Nile Delta. For generations, the Egyptians had defined the limits of Israel's world. Now that power is gone. The book of Exodus describes the scene with a line that feels almost quiet compared to the magnitude of what had happened. Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Imagine standing there. The people who once controlled your labor. The soldiers who enforced Pharaoh's authority. Now washed up along the waterline. Freedom, which only days earlier had felt fragile and uncertain, suddenly became undeniable. No army remained behind them. No chariots could pursue them across the sea. The past had been cut off, and something extraordinary happened at that moment. The people began to sing. The song recorded in Exodus 15 is often called the Song of the Sea, and many scholars believe it is one of the oldest poetic passages preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Its language carries the rhythm and imagery of ancient victory songs, similar to poems discovered in other Near Eastern cultures after major battles. But this victory song is different. Most ancient songs celebrated human kings or military commanders. This one celebrates God. Moses and the Israelites sang to the Lord. The opening lines are powerful and direct. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Notice the imagery. The focus is not on Israel's strength. Israel did not defeat Egypt in battle. The victory belongs entirely to the God who opened the sea. The song continues with language that ancient audiences would immediately recognize. The Lord is a warrior. In the ancient world, gods were often portrayed as warriors who defended their people against enemies. Canaanite texts from cities like Ugarit described gods battling chaos forces in cosmic struggles. But the Exodus song places Israel's God in that role, not as one deity among many, but as the one who has just defeated the empire of Egypt. The poem describes Pharaoh's chariots sinking into the sea. The deep waters have covered them. The imagery almost feels like a reversal of the creation story in Genesis, where waters are separated to allow life to appear. Here the waters close again, swallowing the army that represented oppression. The song widens in scope. It begins describing how surrounding nations will react to what has happened. The people will hear and tremble. Philistia, Edom, Moab, Canaan. These names refer to regions and peoples across the eastern Mediterranean world. News traveled quickly along trade routes and caravan roads. Merchants moving between Gaza, Tyre, and Damascus carried stories of political upheaval from one kingdom to another. Soon the story of Egypt's defeat at the sea would spread across those same routes. The poem also points forward. It speaks about a future place where Israel will be planted, a sanctuary prepared by God. Ancient Jewish interpreters later connected those lines with Mount Zion and the temple that would eventually stand in Jerusalem centuries later. In other words, the song is not only about the past. It looks ahead. The sea crossing becomes the beginning of a much longer journey, one that will eventually lead to a land promised long ago to Abraham. But before that future unfolds, another voice joins the celebration. A woman steps forward. Her name is Miriam, the same sister who once watched over the basket, hidden among the reeds of the Nile when Moses was a baby. The text calls her a prophetess. She takes a tambourine in her hand, and other women follow her with instruments and dancing. Miriam sings a line that echoes the opening of the Song of the Sea. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. It is a moment of joy after centuries of suffering. A people who had spent generations building Egyptian cities now stood on the edge of the wilderness, with no empire behind them. Freedom lay ahead. But freedom would not be easy, because the sea crossing solved only one problem. Pharaoh's army was gone, yet the wilderness stretched out before them, and the desert would soon ask questions that even the miracle of the sea could not answer. Questions about hunger, water, leadership, faith. The road ahead would test the nation that had just been born beside the sea. The celebration beside the sea did not last long. Victory songs echoed across the shoreline that morning. Miriam's tambourine rang out while women danced in circles, repeating the lines of the ancient hymn. For a brief moment, the people who had lived under Egyptian rule for generations stood together without fear. Behind them lay the waters that had swallowed Pharaoh's chariots. Ahead lay the desert. And deserts are not kind to large populations. Soon after leaving the shoreline of the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, the Israelites began moving deeper into the wilderness region that later texts call the Wilderness of Shur. The landscape changed quickly. The fertile edges of the Nile Delta disappeared, replaced by rocky terrain and long stretches of dry ground. For 3 days they traveled. No water. 3 days in desert conditions is enough to drain hope from even the most determined group. The animals grew restless. The people began searching every depression in the ground for signs of moisture. Finally, they reached a place where water existed. The location was called Marah. But the discovery quickly turned into disappointment. The water was bitter, undrinkable. The name Marah itself means bitter, and the word captures both the taste of the water and the mood spreading through the camp. Complaints began to rise again. Only days earlier, the people had stood beside the sea celebrating their deliverance. Now the memory of that miracle felt distant compared to the immediate problem of thirst. "What shall we drink?" they asked Moses. It was the first of many moments when the wilderness would expose the fragile side of Israel's faith. Freedom from Egypt had happened in a single dramatic event. Learning how to live as a free person would take much longer. Moses cried out to God again. The response was unusual. God showed him a piece of wood. When Moses threw the wood into the water, the bitterness disappeared. The water became drinkable. Ancient readers often paused at this moment because the story contains a quiet shift. Until now, the Exodus narrative had focused on spectacular events, plagues, the parting of the sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's army. But here the miracle touches something much more ordinary. Water, survival, the daily needs of a traveling population. It is as if the story is beginning to move from dramatic rescue into the slower work of sustaining life. The text of Exodus adds something important to Marah. God gives the people instructions, guidelines about listening, obedience, and trust. The moment becomes an early test in the wilderness, a place where the relationship between Israel and their God begins to take shape. Jewish teachers centuries later would look back at Marah as the first stage in a long process of forming Israel's identity. Deliverance from Egypt was only the beginning. Now the people had to learn how to live under a different kind of authority. Not Pharaoh, but the God who had brought them out. From Marah, the Israelites continued traveling south. Eventually, they reached a place called Elim. If Marah represented hardship, Elim represented relief. The text describes 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees growing around them. The numbers may carry symbolic meaning. 12 often represents the tribes of Israel, while 70 echoes the original 70 members of Jacob's family who entered Egypt centuries earlier. Whether symbolic or literal, the picture is clear. Shade, water, a place where the people could rest. Imagine the change in atmosphere when the camp arrived there. Children splashing in fresh water. Animals drinking freely. Palm trees provide shelter from the desert sun. After the fear of Pharaoh's army and the bitterness of Marah, Elim must have felt like a gift. But even Elim was only temporary. The journey had just begun. Soon the people would leave the springs behind and continue deeper into the wilderness. And the next test waiting for them would not involve water. It would involve something every human community eventually faces: food. Because once the supplies brought out of Egypt began to run out, the question would return again. Why did we leave Egypt? The wilderness was about to reveal how difficult freedom could be for a people who had spent generations under slavery. And the answer to hunger would come in a form no one expected. Something small, something strange, something that appeared on the ground each morning like dew. The Israelites would call it manna, and it would feed them for years in the desert. Leaving Elim meant leaving comfort behind. The 12 springs and 70 palm trees had provided shade, water, and a moment of calm after the chaos at the sea and the bitterness at Marah. But the Israelites could not remain there. The road to the land promised to Abraham lay farther north and east, across a harsh and uncertain wilderness. So the camp packed up again. From Elim they moved into a region the text calls the Wilderness of Sin, a desert stretch between Elim and the mountain of Sinai. The name sometimes confuses modern readers, but it has nothing to do with moral wrongdoing. It refers to a geographical region along the western side of the Sinai Peninsula, part of the rugged terrain that lies between the Red Sea and the interior mountains. Here the landscape becomes harsher again. No flowing rivers, no fertile soil, just stone, sand, and wind. As the days passed, another problem began to rise inside the camp: food. When the Israelites left Egypt, they carried supplies with them: grain, livestock, and whatever provisions they could gather in the hurried hours after Passover. But large populations consume resources quickly. Families cook daily meals. Animals require fodder. The desert provides almost nothing to replace what is used. Soon the supplies began to run out. And once again the complaints returned. The book of Exodus records the words with uncomfortable honesty. The people began remembering Egypt, not as a place of slavery, but as a place where food had been available. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they said. "There we sat around pots of meat and ate bread until we were full." Memory can be selective. The same people who had cried out under the brutality of Egyptian overseers were now remembering the past in softer colors. Hunger has a way of reshaping how people see their history. Now pause and imagine the challenge facing Moses. He stood between two enormous pressures. Behind him was the empire of Egypt he had defied. In front of him was a restless population questioning the decision to leave. Leadership in the wilderness would require more than dramatic miracles. It would require daily provision. And this time the answer would come quietly. God spoke to Moses again. "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." The phrase sounds poetic, but the people would soon see exactly what it meant. The next morning, something unusual appeared across the desert floor. When the dew lifted, the ground was covered with small flakes, fine white particles scattered like frost. The Israelites stared at it. No one recognized it. "What is it?" they asked each other. In Hebrew, the question itself became the name. Manna. The word literally carries the sense of, what is it? Moses explained the phenomenon. This was the bread God had promised. Each morning the people were to gather only enough for that day. Trying to store it overnight would cause it to spoil. The rhythm forced the community to depend on daily provision rather than building large reserves. On the sixth day, they were to gather twice as much, preparing for a day of rest that would later become known as the Sabbath. The pattern established something new. For centuries, the Israelites had lived under Egyptian systems where labor determined survival. Work quotas, overseers, production schedules, everything depended on human effort directed by the state. Now survival depended on something else. Trust. Each morning, the ground would provide enough. Not excessive supply. Not permanent storage. Just enough for the day. Ancient Jewish teachers later reflected deeply on this moment. Rabbinic writings from communities in Jerusalem and Babylon often described manna as a lesson in dependence, a daily reminder that life ultimately comes from God rather than human control. The story also left traces in later Christian texts. In the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to manna when speaking to crowds near the Sea of Galilee, describing himself as the bread of life. Early Christian interpreters saw the wilderness bread as a sign pointing forward to spiritual nourishment beyond physical survival. But for the Israelites in the wilderness of sin, the meaning was immediate. They were hungry, and now they had food. The manna appeared each morning with the dew. Alongside it, quail sometimes arrived in the evening, birds blown in from migration routes across the Red Sea region, providing meat for the people. Slowly the camp adjusted to the new rhythm. Morning gathering, evening meals, trusting that tomorrow's provision would come when the sun rose again. But the wilderness still had more to teach them, because food was only one part of survival. Soon the people would face another challenge, one that threatened the very stability of the community. Conflict, not with Egypt this time, but with enemies emerging from the desert itself. And the nation that had just been born beside the sea would face its first battle. Freedom had changed Israel's location, but it had not yet changed Israel's character. The people who now moved through the wilderness were no longer slaves of Pharaoh, yet they were still learning what it meant to live without the structure of Egypt's system. In Egypt, life had been harsh but predictable. Labor quotas determined daily rhythms. Food came through the empire's agricultural machine along the Nile. In the desert, survival depended on something very different. Trust. Each morning the manna appeared with the dew. Each evening quail sometimes settled across the camp. Water had been provided at Marah, and the springs of Elim had offered temporary relief. But the wilderness was not finished with them. From the wilderness of sin, the Israelites continued traveling through the rugged interior of the Sinai Peninsula. The journey brought them to a place called Rephidim, another desert campsite where the terrain was rocky and dry. And once again, the problem returned. Water. The camp had grown enormous. Families, livestock, elders, children, an entire population moving together across land that offered almost nothing naturally. Soon the people realized there was no water source nearby. The reaction was immediate. Complaints began rising again, louder this time. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? The accusation carried real desperation. Without water, large groups cannot survive long in desert climates. But the frustration now focused directly on Moses. The text of Exodus even says the people were ready to stone him. Imagine standing in Moses' place. The man who had confronted Pharaoh, who had stretched his staff over the sea, now faced anger from the very people he had led to freedom. So once again he turned to God. What am I to do with these people? The answer came with specific instructions. Moses was to take some of the elders of Israel and go ahead of the camp. In his hand, he carried the same staff that had turned the Nile to blood and stretched over the waters of the sea. They traveled to a rock formation near Mount Horeb, the same mountain region where Moses had first encountered the burning bush. Then something remarkable happened. God told Moses to strike the rock with the staff. When he did, water began flowing out, enough to sustain the entire camp. The place received a name that captured the tension of the moment: Massah and Meribah. Massah means testing. Meribah means quarreling. The names preserved the memory of how the people had tested God and argued with Moses during the crisis. Jewish interpreters later reflected deeply on this moment. In the Psalms, written centuries later during Israel's monarchy, the event at Meribah became a warning. The writers reminded future generations not to harden their hearts the way their ancestors had in the wilderness. Even the New Testament returns to this story. The author of the letter to the Hebrews quotes those same Psalms, urging believers not to repeat the pattern of doubt that appeared in the desert journey. But before the Israelites had time to reflect on the lesson of water from the rock, a new challenge appeared. This time it did not come from hunger or thirst. It came from an enemy. A desert tribe known as the Amalekites attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. The Amalekites were nomadic warriors who moved through the southern desert regions between Canaan and the Sinai Peninsula. Their lifestyle depended on raiding trade routes and vulnerable groups traveling across the wilderness. And the Israelites, with families and livestock moving slowly across difficult terrain, looked like an easy target. This was something new for Israel. Until now, their conflicts had been with Egypt, an empire that had pursued them but never faced them in open battle after the sea. Now they faced a different kind of enemy: desert fighters, vast, experienced, aggressive. Moses responded by appointing a man named Joshua to organize the defense. Joshua would become an important figure later in Israel's history, eventually leading the nation after Moses' death. But here, he appears for the first time as a young military leader preparing to defend the people against Amalek. Joshua gathered fighters and moved toward the battlefield. Meanwhile, Moses climbed a nearby hill with Aaron and another leader named Hur. What happened next was unlike any military strategy in the ancient world. As Joshua fought below, Moses stood on the hill with the staff of God raised in his hands. And something strange became clear. Whenever Moses held his hands up, Israel began to prevail in the battle. When his arms grew tired and lowered, the Amalekites gained the advantage. The connection between the raised staff and the progress of the battle was unmistakable. The outcome was not determined only by swords. It depended on something happening on that hill above the fight. But Moses was human. His arms grew heavy, and the battle was far from finished. The battle at Rephidim continued through the heat of the day. Below the hill, Joshua and the men he had gathered fought against the raiding bands of the Amalekites. The terrain of the southern Sinai region favored mobile fighters who knew how to strike quickly and disappear into desert valleys. Amalekite warriors were used to this kind of fighting. Israel, on the other hand, had only recently left the labor camps of Egypt. These were not seasoned soldiers. They were former brickmakers, shepherds, craftsmen, and families learning to defend themselves for the first time. Yet something unusual was shaping the battle. On the ridge above the fighting stood Moses, holding the same staff that had stretched over the Nile and over the waters of the sea. At first the pattern seemed subtle. When Moses held the staff high, Israel's fighters began pushing forward. When his arms lowered from exhaustion, the Amalekites regained ground. The connection became impossible to ignore. Victory in the valley was somehow tied to what was happening on the hill. Imagine Moses standing there hour after hour. The desert sun beating down. His arms are growing heavier. The staff lifted toward the sky. Eventually fatigue overcame him. His arms dropped. The Amalekites surged again. At that moment, Aaron and Hur understood what needed to happen. They placed a stone beneath Moses so he could sit. Then they stood beside him, one on each side, holding his arms steady as the staff remained raised. The image is striking. 3 men on a hill above the battlefield. Not wielding swords. Not directing troops. Simply holding the symbol of God's authority upright while the battle unfolds below. Ancient Jewish teachers often pointed to this moment as a lesson about dependence. The victory did not come from Israel's military strength alone. It came through a strange partnership, human effort in the valley combined with trust in God above it. The Mishnah, one of the foundational collections of Jewish teaching compiled centuries later, asked an interesting question about this scene. Did Moses' hands win the battle? The answer given by the rabbis was no. Rather, when the people looked upward and directed their hearts toward God, they prevailed. When they lost that focus, they faltered. It was not magic in Moses' hands. It was a reminder of where their strength came from. As the sun moved across the sky and began descending toward the western horizon, Joshua's forces gained the advantage. The Amalekites were driven back. The raiders who had attacked what they believed was a vulnerable group of refugees now found themselves defeated. The Israelites had survived their first battle as a free nation. But the story does not end with the retreat of the Amalekites. After the victory, Moses built an altar at the site. He gave it a name, YHWH Nissi. The Lord is my banner. In ancient warfare, banners or standards were raised above armies as rallying points for soldiers. They marked identity and direction on chaotic battlefields. By naming the altar this way, Moses made a powerful statement. Israel's banner was not a king, not a military symbol, not a tribal flag. Their banner was the God who had brought them out of Egypt. The encounter with Amalek also left a lasting memory in Israel's tradition. Later biblical texts would return to this moment again and again. The book of Deuteronomy reminded future generations never to forget the attack of Amalek against the weary travelers in the wilderness. Centuries later, during the time of the Israelite monarchy, kings like Saul and David would face the descendants of Amalek again. The desert battle at Rephidim became part of Israel's long historical memory. But the wilderness journey was still moving forward. After the conflict with Amalek, another visitor arrived in the Israelite camp. A man who had known Moses long before the burning bush. His name was Jethro, the priest of Midian. And his arrival would bring an unexpected kind of wisdom to the growing nation in the desert. Because the challenge Israel now faced was not just survival. It was an organization. A massive population moving through the wilderness needed structure, leadership, and systems for resolving disputes. And Jethro was about to show Moses that even a man called by God cannot carry the burden of leadership alone. The nation born beside the sea was growing. and soon it would arrive at the mountain, where its identity would be defined forever. The mountain of Sinai. Not long after the battle with the Amalekites, a small caravan approached the Israelite camp. Among the travelers were familiar faces. Zipporah, the wife of Moses, was there. So were their sons, Gershom and Eliezer, and leading the group was a man Moses respected deeply, his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. For years, before the burning bush changed everything, Moses had lived under Jethro's roof. He attended sheep across the same rugged desert regions where the Israelites were now traveling. Jethro had known Moses not as a prophet or national leader, but as a quiet shepherd learning to rebuild his life after fleeing Egypt. Now he arrived to see what had become of him. When Moses heard the news, he went out to meet him. The two men embraced, and Moses brought Jethro into his tent. There he began recounting everything that had happened. The confrontation with Pharaoh, the plagues that struck Egypt, the night of Passover, the crossing of the sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's army, the battles and hardships of the wilderness. Imagine Jethro listening to this story. The shepherd he once employed had become the leader of an entire people. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had acted with power that even the great empire of Egypt could not resist. Jethro's reaction is recorded with striking clarity. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. For someone raised among the religious traditions of Midian, that statement carried enormous weight. It did not deny the existence of other spiritual powers recognized in the ancient world, but it declared that the God who delivered Israel stood above them all. Jethro offered sacrifices to God. Then he joined Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel for a shared meal, an ancient sign of fellowship and recognition. But Jethro did not come only to celebrate. The next day he watched Moses at work. From morning until evening, people lined up outside Moses' tent bringing disputes, questions, and conflicts. In a camp containing thousands of families, disagreements were inevitable. Questions about property, livestock, injuries, promises, every issue eventually reached Moses. And Moses handled them all. One by one, hour after hour. Jethro observed quietly. Finally, he asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the problem. What you are doing is not good. The words might sound harsh, but they came from concern. Moses was trying to carry the entire burden of leadership alone. Jethro continued, "You will surely wear yourself out, and these people as well. The work is too heavy for you." Then he offered a solution. Instead of judging every case personally, Moses should appoint capable leaders from among the people. These men would oversee smaller groups, leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Only the most difficult cases would be brought to Moses himself. The system was simple. Shared leadership. Delegated responsibility. Moses listened carefully, and he accepted the advice. The structure Jethro suggested became one of the first administrative systems in Israel's history. It allowed justice to function across the entire community without overwhelming a single leader. The moment carries an interesting lesson. Moses had spoken with God at the burning bush. He had stretched his staff over the sea. Yet the wisdom that helped organize Israel's leadership came from his father-in-law, a Midianite priest. The story quietly reminds readers that divine calling does not eliminate the need for practical wisdom from others. With the leadership structure in place, the Israelite community became more stable. Disputes could be resolved. Responsibilities shared. The people were learning how to function as something new. Not slaves. Not just refugees. a nation. Soon the journey would bring them to the place that had appeared in Moses' first encounter with God, the mountain where the bush burned with fire. Mount Sinai. In the ancient world, mountains often symbolized meeting places between heaven and earth. Canaanite traditions placed their gods on peaks like Mount Zaphon. Greek myths later imagined Mount Olympus as the home of the gods. But the mountain Israel was approaching would become something different. Not the home of a god among many, but the place where an entire nation would enter into a covenant. The people who had left Egypt as slaves would receive laws, identity, purpose, and a calling that would shape history for centuries to come. The wilderness had tested them. Now the mountain would transform them. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites reached the place where the desert floor rises toward the jagged peaks of Mount Sinai. The journey that began with a hurried escape from Goshen had carried them through bitter water at Marah, the springs of Elim, the hunger of the wilderness of Sin, the battle at Rephidim, and the growing structure of leadership that Jethro helped establish. Now the people camped at the foot of a mountain that would define their future. The book of Exodus describes the moment simply. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. But the setting carried enormous weight. For Moses, Sinai was already familiar. This was the region where he had first encountered the burning bush while tending the flocks of Midian. It was here that the voice had spoken from the fire and declared the name YHWH. It was here that Moses had been told something that probably sounded impossible at the time. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now the promise has come full circle. The people who once labored under Egyptian overseers were standing before the same mountain where their deliverance had been announced. Moses climbed the slopes alone. Mountains in the ancient world often served as meeting places between heaven and earth. In nearby cultures, sacred peaks were associated with divine presence. The Canaanite god Baal was believed to dwell on Mount Zaphon near the coast of modern-day Syria. Later Greek traditions imagined Mount Olympus as the dwelling place of their gods. But Sinai would become something different. Not the residence of a god, but the place where a covenant would be formed between God and an entire people. When Moses reached the mountain, God spoke again. The message Moses received began by recalling the events the people had just lived through. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. The words pointed back to the plagues, the night of Passover, and the crossing of the sea where Pharaoh's chariots were swallowed by the returning waters. Then came a powerful image. I carried you on eagles' wings and brought you to myself. In the ancient Near East, the eagle symbolized strength and protection. The image suggests a powerful creature lifting its young above danger, carrying them to safety. The message continued. Now, if the people would listen to God and keep His covenant, they would become something unique among the nations. A kingdom of priests, a holy nation. The language introduced a new identity. Until now, Israel had been defined mostly by its past, descendants of Abraham, survivors of Egyptian slavery. Now the future was being described. A people set apart. A nation with a role that extended beyond itself. The phrase kingdom of priests would echo through later biblical writings. Priests served as mediators between God and the people. The idea suggested that Israel itself would carry a kind of mediating role among the nations. Centuries later, early Christian writers would revisit that language. The first letter of Peter, written to communities scattered across the Roman Empire, describes believers as a royal priesthood, echoing the promise originally spoken at Sinai. But at this moment, standing at the foot of the mountain, the Israelites were hearing the words for the first time. Moses descended the mountain and gathered the elders. He delivered the message exactly as it had been given. The elders discussed the proposal. Then they gave a response that would shape the rest of the story. "We will do everything the Lord has said." The agreement sounded confident, perhaps even optimistic. But the covenant they were accepting would soon reveal something deeper about human nature. Because agreeing to a covenant is easier than living within it. Still, the commitment had been made. Moses carried the people's answer back up the mountain. God responded with instructions. In 3 days, something extraordinary would happen. The people were to prepare themselves, wash their garments, consecrate themselves, and gather at the base of the mountain. But they were unable to climb it. Boundaries would be set around the mountain. No one was to cross them. Because when the 3rd day arrived, the mountain itself would become the stage for one of the most dramatic encounters between God and humanity in the entire biblical story. Thunder, fire, smoke rising into the sky, and a voice that would speak words shaping law, morality, and identity for thousands of years. The people who had once lived under the laws of Pharaoh were about to receive something new. A covenant. And the first words of that covenant would begin with a reminder. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt." The camp at the base of Mount Sinai entered 3 days of preparation. For the Israelites, the instructions Moses carried down from the mountain must have felt both exciting and unsettling. They had witnessed astonishing events since leaving Egypt, the plagues that shattered Pharaoh's authority, the night of Passover, the sea that opened before them. Yet nothing quite prepared them for what Sinai would become. The people were told to prepare themselves. They washed their garments. Families spoke quietly about what might happen. Boundaries were placed around the mountain so no one would approach too closely. Even animals were kept back from the slopes. Something holy was about to occur. And holiness in the biblical imagination carried a sense of both beauty and danger. When the 3rd morning arrived, the desert sky changed. Thunder rolled across the mountain. Lightning flashed through thick clouds that had settled over the peak. The text describes smoke rising from the mountain as if a furnace were burning inside it. Then came a sound unlike anything the people had heard before. A trumpet blast, not played by human hands, growing louder and louder. Imagine standing in that crowd. Thousands of people gathered across the desert plain, looking up at a mountain wrapped in smoke and fire while thunder echoed across the rocks. The ground itself begins to tremble. The book of Exodus says the entire mountain shook violently. Ancient readers often compared this moment to the appearance of a king arriving with overwhelming power. But this was not a human ruler stepping onto a battlefield. This was the God who had defeated Egypt, the God who had opened the sea, the God who had fed the people with manna in the wilderness. Now that God was about to speak. Moses climbed the mountain again, entering the smoke while the people remained below. Then the voice came. The words spoken from Sinai would become the foundation of Israel's law and moral vision. They are often called the 10 Commandments, though the biblical text refers to them as the 10 words. The opening line did not begin with a rule. It began with a reminder. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Before the covenant demanded anything, it reminded the people who had delivered them. The laws that followed were not presented as random regulations. They were the terms of a relationship between God and the nation that had been rescued from Pharaoh's rule. The commandments themselves moved in two directions. The first focused on the relationship between Israel and God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In the ancient world, these commands were radical. Surrounding cultures often worshipped many gods tied to specific locations or natural forces. Egypt had its pantheon of deities, Ra, Amun, Hathor, Osiris, each honored with temples and rituals. But the covenant at Sinai demanded something different. Exclusive loyalty. The God who delivered Israel was not one deity among many. He was the only one they were to worship. Then the commandments turned toward human relationships. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not covet. These instructions formed the moral core of Israel's law. They addressed family loyalty, respect for life, faithfulness in marriage, honesty in community, and the inner attitude of the human heart. The commandments were short, direct, but their influence would spread far beyond the wilderness of Sinai. Jewish communities across centuries, whether in Jerusalem, Babylon, or later Alexandria, treated these words as the foundation of their covenant identity. Early Christian writers also returned to them repeatedly. In the Gospels, Jesus refers to the commandments when teaching in Galilee and Jerusalem, and later Christian theologians interpreted them as expressions of moral law written into human conscience. But for the people standing at Sinai, the experience was overwhelming. The thunder continued. The trumpet sound grew louder. The mountain burned with fire. The people trembled. They stepped back from the mountain and spoke to Moses. "You speak to us," they said, "and we will listen, but do not let God speak directly to us or we will die." The fear was understandable. Direct encounters with divine power were not comfortable experiences in the ancient world. Moses responded with reassurance. "Do not be afraid." But then he added something that revealed the purpose of the moment. God had come so that the people would learn reverence, so they would understand the seriousness of the covenant being established. The scene at Sinai marked a transformation. The Israelites were no longer just refugees escaping slavery. They were becoming something new, a covenant nation. And the words spoken from the mountain were only the beginning. Because the laws of Sinai would expand into a detailed system guiding every part of life, justice, worship, community, and identity. The nation born beside the sea was now being shaped at the mountain. And what happened at Sinai would echo far beyond the desert. For centuries, for civilizations, for the moral imagination of the world. The thunder around Mount Sinai slowly faded. The trumpet sound that had echoed across the desert plain finally quieted. Smoke still rose from the slopes, and the people of Israel stood at a distance, shaken by what they had just witnessed. Moments earlier, they had heard the voice of the God who delivered them from Egypt. Now they waited, and the story reached a new phase. The dramatic rescue that began with Passover and the opening of the sea had brought Israel out of slavery. But Sinai revealed that deliverance alone was not the final goal. The purpose was covenant. For the next stretch of time, Moses would move repeatedly between the mountain and the camp. He carried instructions down from the mountain, laws governing justice, responsibility, worship, and daily life. Some laws addressed ordinary disputes. How should conflicts between neighbors be resolved? What happens when property is damaged? How should vulnerable people, widows, orphans, foreigners, be treated within the community? Other instructions shaped worship. Altars, sacrifices, festivals. The calendar itself would now revolve around events like Passover, the festival that remembered the night Israel left Egypt. The covenant reached into every corner of life. Ancient readers often noticed something remarkable about this section of the book of Exodus. The laws given at Sinai were not designed for kings or aristocrats alone. Many ancient legal systems in the Near East, like the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, focused heavily on maintaining social hierarchy. But Sinai spoke frequently about protecting the weak. You shall not oppress the foreigner. You shall not mistreat the widow or the orphan. You shall not pervert justice for the poor. The people who had once suffered under the harsh authority of Pharaoh were now being told to build a society that remembered that suffering. Their past in Egypt was meant to shape their future behavior. Eventually, the covenant was formally confirmed. Moses wrote down the words of the agreement and read them aloud before the people. Once again, they responded with the same declaration they had made earlier. We will do everything the Lord has said. Sacrifices were offered. An altar was built. Then Moses performed a symbolic act that ancient covenant ceremonies often included. He sprinkled blood on the altar and on the people. Behold the blood of the covenant. The phrase would echo centuries later in a surprising place. During a Passover meal in Jerusalem, according to the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth spoke similar words while sharing bread and wine with his disciples. This is the blood of the covenant. Early Christian writers saw a deep connection between the covenant established at Sinai and the events surrounding Jesus' death during Passover. For them, the Exodus story had always pointed forward to something larger. But in the desert of Sinai, those later interpretations were still far in the future. For now, Israel stood at the beginning of its national identity. The former slaves of Egypt had become a covenant people. And yet, like every human community, their story would not remain simple. The wilderness still stretched ahead. New challenges would arise. Moments of faith and moments of failure. But the memory of the Exodus would never disappear. Centuries later, prophets speaking in cities like Jerusalem would remind Israel of the God who led them through the sea. Jewish communities scattered across the world, from Babylon to Alexandria, would gather each year to celebrate Passover, retelling the story of the night their ancestors walked out of Egypt. And even the final book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, returns to the imagery of the Exodus. There, believers are described as standing beside a sea again, singing a song of Moses. The story never stopped echoing, because the Exodus was never only about leaving Egypt. It was about something deeper. A person discovering who they were, a covenant shaping how they would live, and a memory powerful enough to travel across centuries, cultures, and civilizations. Imagine standing there at the base of Sinai as the desert wind moves across the camp. Behind you lies the sea where an empire fell. Before you lies a long journey toward a land promised to Abraham generations earlier. And above you rises the mountain where the voice of God once spoke through fire. The night the sea opened had given birth to a nation. But Sinai gave that nation its soul.